Hey, everybody, we're back. Welcome. So glad to have you all here. It's going to be a great show tonight. Going to be a great show. So hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. I do have the super chats from earlier today. They are still written down, and we will get to those tonight. So have no fear. It was a great show this afternoon, and now we're going to do a great show tonight. So welcome, everybody. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. And away we go. And away we go.
Of the American century. I say that the century on which we are entering can be and must be the century of the common man.
A radical redistribution of economic power.
I mean, we know that racism is just a byproduct of capitalism. Everything would be all right if everything was put back in the hands of the people.
We need a government that will make sure Americans are taken care of and organize the economy to serve the people, not the profits of a wealthy few.
We now have the techniques and the resources to get rid of poverty.
We got to start getting out there with the people.
Get out of the movement and get to the masses.
We need a government of action.
All right, everybody. So glad to have you here. We are streaming on Facebook, we are streaming on YouTube, and we're streaming on Rockfin. Pretty soon, we're going to be streaming on Rumble. Haven't started that yet, but we're going to do that pretty soon. Why the heck not, right? Rumble is where you can watch RT. You can watch RT on Rumble. The imperialists, the French imperialists, the U.S. imperialists are going after Rumble, so it'd be a great place to stream. We're going to be doing that. One thing, folks, be sure to crush the subscribe button and the notifications bell, because the YouTube algorithms unsubscribe people. They actually unsubscribe people on the YouTube algorithms. And right now, it seems like people are getting unsubscribed against their will. I've gotten a few messages from people. So be sure to hit the subscribe button and the notifications bell, because you don't want to miss out on what we do here. People aren't getting the notifications. Make sure you do that. We're on Odyssey as well, Jenny Lynn points out. Very good point. Another quick business announcement before we rush into things. Another quick business announcement. Patreon. I am back, and I am on Patreon. And there's a good crew of folks who stayed loyal during our little pause. I'm back on Patreon. In the next 10 days, I'm going to do a patrons only stream for our patron community. So if you want to be part of that, if you used to be part of the Patreon and you want to reactivate, or if you're already, part of it, or if you want to be part of it in the next 10 days, I'm going to do a patrons only stream. I take good care of my patrons. I send every patron books when we publish books. During the break, I published a new book, Capitalism Must Be Destroyed, compilation of my writings from earlier years. So I've been sending that out to folks that are members of the Patreon. And when I publish a new book, I always tend to send it out. In the next 10 days, we're going to probably have a patrons only stream. So sign up. Not probably. We will have a patrons only stream in the next 10 days. So sign up. And, we're trying to get the Patreon going again. That's a quick business announcement. Now, for those of you who may not be familiar with how we do these streams, you're not familiar with it. The way we do these streams is I give some opening remarks. And while I'm making the opening remarks, I write your super chats down. Then after my opening remarks are done, we do the roll call. And in the roll call, we find out who's on the other side of the camera. We find out people's names and locations. We get to know the community that's here. Then after that, I answer super chats. And I already have 4 super chats left over from earlier today. There are 4 of them left over from earlier today. So we'll be getting to those first, and then we'll be proceeding. So if there's something you want me to talk about in the second half of the show, send me a super chat. I'll be writing them down throughout the show. That's how it works. I answer your questions. And those super chats keep this show going for a while. Sometimes the super chats just keep coming and the show just keeps going. And really, the beauty of the show is the super chats. People ask me about all kinds of random shit, and I do my best to give an answer. There are some times where I just can't answer, but for the most part, I do give good answers. So if you want to You want to ask about something, just shoot me a super chat. And here we are. And yes, another stream today. We're streaming a lot. We were streaming a lot because, hey, I've got a whole room here for streaming. My wife and I, we just moved into a great new apartment. I've got a whole room for streaming, and I'm going to be on here as much as we possibly can. We're just going to keep going, right? Because I missed you all so much. I'm so glad to be back. This is like day 5 since relaunch, and things are going amazingly well. So hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell, crush that notifications bell, and away we go. So, folks, I wanted to talk about something that has been coming up a lot on a lot of different streams, but it's something that we have to be clear about. First of all, one thing that I always remind people to do is when you're talking about the kind of stuff that we talk about on these streams, you cannot assume that people know anything about it, because they don't, right? People don't have awareness about political issues, etc. So it's really important that you explain things. It's really important that you help people to understand what you're talking about. And one of my biggest pet peeves in left circles is people using buzzwords and not knowing what they mean. For example, contradiction. What is contradiction? Right? When I first came around leftist circles, everyone was talking about the contradictions of blah, 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 the contradictions, blah, 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 the contradictions, blah, blah, blah. Well, I now know most of those people didn't even know what the term meant. And it wasn't until years later when I was reading the history of the three internationals, the foundations of the fundamentals of Marxism, Leninism, that I understood this referred to the dialectic and the idea that change comes through struggle, and the thesis, antithesis, synthesis, cycle, the dialectic, the Hegelian dialectic, the idea that change comes through clashes in ideas, right? That's what they were referring to. It was very different than the way the term is used in everyday speech, right? Everyday speech, if someone says the opposite of what you're saying, they're contradicting you, right? It's not what it means. Contradiction refers to a philosophical concept, the dialectic, that change comes through contradiction, change comes through clash, and disagreement, and that history is driven forward by forces clashing with each other, and that's what it's referring to. But no one explained that. And I'm sure most of the leftists that I heard talking about it, they didn't know what it meant either. They were just faking it. And one of my classic examples of this is the term neoliberal. Neoliberalism is an economic theory. It is a form of economics. It is the teachings of Milton Friedman, Friedrich von Hayek, Alan Greenspan. It is the idea that the government should stay out of the economy, that the government's only job is to make sure that private capitalists are making money. It is free market economics. But so many people use the term neoliberal to mean moderate Democrat. They think, well, there's real liberals, then there's neoliberals, and they're like moderate. That's not what the term means at all. It is an economic term. Neoliberalism is an economic term, and neoliberalism was first embraced by conservatives. It was Republicans, Reaganites that pushed neoliberalism first. Now, eventually, Bill Clinton and New Labor, Tony Blair brought it into the left in Britain and into the Democratic Party in the United States, but it's an economic term. And it gets particularly annoying because in my writing, I have talked about a crisis of liberalism. And when I talk about a crisis of liberalism, I'm not referring to a crisis of the Democratic Party. I'm not referring to a crisis of activist leftists, liberals. I'm also not even referring to a crisis necessarily of the economy. In my writing, I've written about a crisis of liberalism. And I was attacked by the Communist Party. This idiot named Chris Butters was assigned by the Communist Party to write a hit piece about me. He put it on the Communist Party website. And he used the fact that I referred to a crisis of liberalism to say I was blaming the Democrats for all of America's problems. And he clearly did not know what I was referring to. And it's an important concept. Liberalism is an important thing to understand. And we as a society are living in a crisis of liberalism. Now, economic liberalism, that's what neoliberal economics refers to. That's one form of liberalism. Social liberalism, that's mainly what is emphasized by the Democratic Party. Social liberalism refers to one thing, but I'm referring to both economic liberalism and social liberalism. I'm referring to an entire mindset called liberalism. And we are living in the breakdown and crisis of Western liberalism. This is the death agony of liberalism. Liberalism is breaking apart, and this is an important thing to understand. And idiots like Chris Butters don't know what it means, and it's important. I want you all to understand what liberalism refers to and why we are living in a crisis of liberalism. And that's not a crisis of Democrats. It's not a crisis of left-wing people. It's a crisis of liberalism. So I'm going to show you. This is a news item, a video item that just happened here in New York City. This is a great example of the society we're living in, right? This is what happens when we're living in a society with a crisis of liberalism. Incidents like this are happening all the time in New York City. You watch the local news, New York One. You know, I live in New York City, a very high concentration of the population. We have a very active public transportation system here in New York City, which most of the country doesn't have. And it's awful. It's falling apart, but we at least have it. And incidents like this just keep happening, especially since the pandemic. It's like daily we have incidents like this. I'm going to show you this. This is just one incident that takes place. This is some disturbing footage. This happened recently in the New York City subways. This is New York City news footage. Take a look.
Punch after punch thrown on a crowded 5 train, hitting a mom and her little girl in the head and face. This brutal attack near the Intervale Avenue stop in the Bronx.
This is no good, you know. I'm going to work. I'm going to use every day the train, every day the tram. I take my daughter to school. It's no good.
Mom, who asked not to be identified, says she picked up her 5th grade daughter from school. They were riding home, and she has no idea what provoked this attack.
I mean, just he punched the head is like crazy. Just he boom, 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 no say nothing to me, nothing. You know, the people see nobody doing nothing.
Another person riding the train recorded video of this attack. The injured mom says her only thought was to wrap her arms around her daughter and shield her child from the rage of a stranger who police say is around 5 feet 8 inches tall and 215 pounds.
Just I make it hard. I say, no worries, okay. The mom is here. I protect you. No worry. He said, somebody's punching again. You. I say, no worry. You okay? No worry, mommy. Mama's okay.
As the NYPD searches for the attacker, mom and daughter struggle with the emotional trauma inflicted by the hatred of a stranger.
When they see too much people, she said, no go to the train. It's not easy for her.
She's scared.
Yeah, she is scared. It's not easy for her. She is, you know, the student. They say, oh, maybe again somebody's doing the same one.
Now, so this woman, she goes and picks her daughter up from school. They get on the subway. You know, it's a time of day where the subway is pretty crowded. And out of the blue, no one knows why, this person comes over and just starts punching both of them. And no one has any clue why. Just randomly, this man walks over and starts attacking a mother and a daughter on the train. And you saw the video there. What the hell is going on? What in the world? I mean, this is like an episodes of bizarre insanity where people just get on subway trains and commit random acts of violence. They're just full of rage and anger, and they just attack random people on the subway. This keeps happening in New York City. It's happening a lot, and it's really disturbing and crazy. Why in the world did this person do that? We don't know. Some people are saying, was this a racial thing? You know, no, we don't know that. I mean, he didn't, apparently, no one says he was shouting slurs or saying, just randomly, he decides to start punching a mother and a daughter. And that daughter is terrified to get on the train, and the mother was trying to protect the daughter. It's a horrendous incident, right? What motivates somebody to just do this, right? You know, this isn't like normal criminality, right? He wasn't robbing them to get their money, He wasn't, it wasn't, like a serial killer type situation. It's just some guy is on the train. The train is crowded full of people. He sees a mom and her daughter and just decides to start violently attacking them. Right. This is something that many people have pointed out. We're having a society-wide crisis of mental health. Right. The suicide rate is through the roof in the United States right now. Very high suicide rate. In addition to that, drug addiction is really high. Alcoholism is high. Heroin, opioid addictions are very, very high. Young people that are reporting themselves to be depressed, young people that are reporting themselves to be paranoid or have some kind of mental illness is very high. Something is deeply wrong in our society, and incidents like this keep happening. And if you walk around New York City, I was in Manhattan yesterday to film a story for RT. We went to near the UN to film a story. And it's like the amount of people I see talking to themselves, the amount of people I see, who don't look well is through the roof. I mean, New York City's always had that problem. Okay. I mean, if you go to any major city, you're going to see crazy people, right? I mean, that happens, I remember I was in Cleveland at a bus stop and there was a woman one time, like talking to herself, having an argument with somebody who wasn't there. And then she started like throwing rocks at the person who wasn't there. I mean, that happens. Okay. Washington, DC, Pittsburgh, when you have high concentrations of the population, you're going to have crazy people. Okay. And that's just a tragedy. But suddenly, since the pandemic, I am seeing it way, way more. I'm seeing it way more. And what's also scary is that, usually the people that you see that are they're having a mental health moment. Usually the people that you see doing that are homeless people, right? I mean, that their mental health has gotten to be homeless. Not anymore. Did that guy who violently attacked that couple, did he look homeless to you? He didn't look homeless to me. That looked like a nice coat he was wearing. Those looked like nice glasses he was wearing. He did not look homeless. That was not a homeless guy, who was, crazy. And no, that looked like a perfectly healthy, well-dressed individual who just decided to get on the subway and he saw a short woman and her daughter who she just picked up from school and just decided he was going to violently attack them on a subway full of crowded people. I mean, this is a problem that we are having as a society. And I pin this distinctly on what we can call the crisis of liberalism. So what is liberalism? I'm not talking about political liberalism, the Democratic Party, people that are in favor of more liberal policies, legalizing gay marriage, legalizing drugs. That's not what I'm talking about. And I'm not talking about economic liberalism, people who want more free market, people who want the government less involved, people who want lower taxation, people who think the state should subsidize corporations more, facilitate the free market more. That's not what I'm talking about. I am talking about liberalism as an ideology. That's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the ideology of liberalism. Liberalism is the school of thought that comes out of the Enlightenment. All right, so let's go back to the beginning of human history. The overwhelming majority of human history, we were hunter-gatherers. We were in tribes of people, maybe 20 to 30 people. We're in tribes, and we hunted and gathered. And we went around hunting animals. We went around gathering fruits and nuts to eat, and we hunted and gathered in our tribes of people. That's what we did. We were hunter-gatherers. And in those tribes, there was very little individuality. People depended on each other. And, there was no real family unit. There were couples. There was some form of romance to some degree or other, but they didn't even keep track of whose kid was whose kid. The whole tribe was one big family. The life expectancy was very low. People weren't living higher than 25 or 30 years of age. And they were busy all the time hunting and gathering. They had very little free time because there was, they were just hunting and gathering all the time. And this is what they call primitive communism. Because in those tribes of 20 to 30 people, there was no real social hierarchy. No one was exploiting anyone else. I mean, there might be one individual who was designated as like the leader of the tribe. That might have happened, right? There were often older women who were kind of held in reverence. They talk about matriarchy and such. But for the most part, in hunter-gatherer civilization, everyone was kind of equal, right? Maybe if you were the hunter who killed an animal, you got the best cut of the meat because you killed it, right? Maybe there was reverence for older folks, right? People who lived longer than other people. They were kind of held in reverence and given special reverence. But other than that, there was no one exploiting everybody else. The whole tribe hunted and gathered together. And that was what they call primitive communism. And that all started to change when human beings got too good at hunting and gathering. We developed spears and rocks, and we figured out how to hunt really, really well. We started paying attention to the patterns and how plants grow, and we got very good at hunting and gathering. With our creativity and our brilliance and our scientific mind, human beings got very good at hunting and gathering. And so what happened? Well, there was a scarcity of animals to hunt because we were so damn good at hunting them. And there was a shortage of fruits and nuts to gather because we got so damn good at gathering them. And all of a sudden, there was a big crisis and people started starving and there was a big problem. And then somebody came along and said, hey, we can start growing our own food and we can start breeding and domesticating animals to eat so we don't have to hunt them in the wild. And it was a process that took thousands of years. The first social revolution, the transition from hunter-gatherer civilization to agriculture. That was the first social revolution. And in order to resolve a problem brought on by our increasing productivity, right? We got increasingly good at hunting and gathering. We got increasingly productive. We were innovative. We invented new methods of doing what we did. We were collective in our innovation. The whole tribe was working together to figure out the best ways to hunt and gather. And we got so damn good at it that it created an economic crisis. Because with our brilliance, with our creativity, we got so good at hunting and gathering. We got so good at it that our creative abilities had overcome and had outmoded the economic system we were living under. So out of necessity, we had to move to a higher economic system. And you got the origin of private property. You got the origin of the family. You got the origin of the state. That we moved from hunter-gatherer, primitive communism to slavery and feudalism, in which land was owned by individuals, in which there was a family, in which there was a patriarch, a father who was the head of the household, who, when he died, the land that he had got passed on to his children, right? And we got the institution of marriage, and we got the state to make sure that no one took anyone else's property, to enforce property, right? And that a higher mode of production emerged to replace a lower mode of production. And then fast forward to Europe, 1400s, 1500s, the Silk Road from Asia was bringing in all kinds of foreign products, and there was a new class of merchants and traders who were bringing in different products. The craftsmen were bringing in new innovations from Asia. The printing press came in. The printing press was originally developed on the Korean Peninsula. It eventually expanded to China. And then Marco Polo brought the printing press in theory, but then ultimately you had Johannes Gutenberg, who started using the printing press in Europe. You got all kinds of breakthroughs, and suddenly human creativity and human brilliance had overcome feudalism, and the feudal system was holding back human productivity. And so you had the French Revolution, and you had the English Civil War, and you had an explosion of revolutions across Europe, and capitalism, industrial capitalism, came to replace feudalism because we were moving to a higher mode of production. And that's the history of human beings, right? First hunter-gatherer civilization. That's the bulk of human history. Then after that, you get slavery, which is the ancient Greece, which is ancient Rome, ancient Egypt. Then out of slavery comes feudalism. And then out of feudalism comes capitalism. Now we live in the period of capitalism. And according to Marxism, after capitalism comes socialism, right? The idea is that, and it's already starting to happen, that capitalism has spread all over the world in its highest stage of imperialism. And countries around the world that want to keep developing and keep growing have had to break out of capitalism and have started to move towards socialism. And we have socialism in China, we have socialism in Vietnam, socialism in Cuba. So this is the history of human civilization. Human beings are creative creatures. They're tool makers, and they are constantly forcing their environment to serve them and doing so in more creative and efficient ways and pushing themselves to a higher mode of production, to a higher form of civilization. This is how human beings work. This is called historical materialism. This is how Marx and Engels understood human history. This is the brilliance of Marxism, is this materialist understanding that we are striving for a higher mode of production. So this is what you have to understand. So what's liberalism? Well, under feudalism, the peasant has a place on the land. The peasant exists to serve the noble, the landowner, the military that enforces the social order. They swear an oath to their king. Everyone has a place in feudalism. And everyone is loyal to the feudal order. And the feudal order is extremely unjust. And the feudal order is extremely degrading to certain people. Do you ever heard of prima nocta? You ever heard of that? Let's just talk about that, right? Feudalism is a very degrading system. One of the things you'll hear from some of these strange right-wing anti-capitalists, they try to make it sound like feudalism was a good system. Feudalism was not a good system. Breaking out, moving toward capitalism was a great step forward, right? Overcoming feudalism. Feudalism was holding back productivity. Feudalism was not a good system. One reason that feudalism wasn't a good system is you couldn't have technological innovation. In feudalism, most people are peasants. Some people are nobles and landowners. And some people, then you have craftsmen. You know, that in feudalism, you have blacksmiths, you have leather makers, you got basket weavers, you have craftsmen to make the few things. But the craftsmen are all in these things called guilds, right? They're like orders, right? That blacksmiths, you get to be a blacksmith if your father was a blacksmith, right? You get to be a basket weaver or a wood carver if your father was a wood carver or a basket weaver. And you get trained. You go through an apprenticeship to learn to be a blacksmith or a craftsman. But one of the rules of the guilds was that you couldn't change how to do it. If you thought of a new, more efficient way of being a blacksmith, if you thought of a new, more efficient way of being a basket weaver, you weren't allowed to do it. And if you broke that, if you were a blacksmith and you said, hey, there's a more efficient way of forging metal, they would take away your ability to do it. They would expel you from the guild and you were kicked out of it. So the guilds held back technology. And it's one of the big problems with feudalism was that the reason they called it the Dark Ages was nobody was allowed to advance technologically. One of the rules of all the craftsman guilds was that you were not allowed to innovate. You were not allowed to invent new things. You weren't allowed to make technology more efficient. You had to keep doing it in the same old way. Another aspect of feudalism was that there was a constant degradation of the peasantry. The peasantry were constantly being reminded that they were inferior to the nobles, right? And there were all kinds of humiliating practices. For example, right, in the English language, nowadays we call everyone you. It's like, how are you doing? I'm doing well. But if you read old English texts, there's thee and thou. Why is there thee and thou? Well, because in feudalism, some people are considered superior to others. And you refers to people of some rank, and thee and thou refers to people of another rank. There was special designations. Not everyone got you and he and she. Some people got thee and thou because there was different ranks, and and different people got different pronouns and different verbs to refer to them, right? This was how the feudal system was set up. And I mentioned before, prima nocta. You ever watch the movie Braveheart? They show it in the movie Braveheart. Now, Braveheart is not historically accurate. They did not do this in Scotland, but they did it in France. The nobility, right? The nobility. If you were a peasant, you were on land that was owned by a noble, by a lord or a duke or something like that, right? You were on the land. And in France, they developed this practice that if two peasants got married, on the first night they got married, the local lord got to have sex with the bride. And it was intended to humiliate the peasant husband, to humiliate him, to remind him that he was the inferior of the noble lord. It was a horrendous practice. Basically, every woman who got married, on the first night she was married, she got raped in front of her husband. Can you imagine that level of degrading humiliation, right? I mean, that's utter cruelty, but that was done routinely. And why were they doing that? To tell the peasantry, you are less than the lord. You are less than the noble. He has control over you. And so in every single marriage started out with the lord or the feudal aristocrat raping the woman. I mean, can you imagine something? That's how ugly feudalism was. So don't let anyone tell you feudalism was a good system. It wasn't. Peasants were horrifically treated in feudalism. People didn't have rights. If you so much as said, I think that the Catholic Church is wrong about something, you got burned at the stake, right? That was heresy. You were a heretic. You got burned at the stake. It wasn't a good system, okay? It was not a good system. But regardless, right? As human technology advanced and as human creativity advanced, feudalism was overcome. And as feudalism was being overcome and capitalism was becoming the new system, a new ideology emerged, right? The doctrine that held feudalism together was the teachings of the Roman Catholic Church. The Pope was considered the emissary, the voice of God on earth with papal infallibility. He gave the authority to all the kings to rule with their divine right. And the Vatican was kind of at the center, the arbitrator of disputes. You had the kings of Europe, and that's how things worked. And it was the Catholic Church and their ideology that kind of held together medieval Europe. But with the Protestant Reformation, and then eventually with the overthrow of feudalism, we have a new ideology. So it starts in Britain, it starts in France, it starts in Germany. People start talking about the rights of man. And people start talking about, you have John Locke talking about life, liberty, and property. And suddenly, there starts to be a new ideology to match capitalism. And that ideology is what we call liberalism. It's the view that the right of the individual stands supreme. That individualism is sacred. All right. Writing it down. Thanks for the super chat. And if anyone else has any more super chats, please send them my way. Thank you, Clyde. That the right of the individual stands supreme. That is liberalism. Liberalism is celebration of the individual. Liberalism is the belief that the individual, on his own, should be celebrated above all else. And liberalism, when it started, was a good development. It said you have the right to choose your own religion, freedom of religion. That's good. You have the right to pick your own job, right? You don't have to be a blacksmith because your father was a blacksmith. You don't have to be a peasant because your father was a peasant. You can pick your own job, right? Liberalism was the idea that you have freedom of conscience, that you can espouse your own ideas. Liberalism was freedom of speech, freedom of expression. Right? When the U.S. Constitution first came in, the 13 colonies wouldn't ratify it unless it had a Bill of Rights, right? The right to freedom of religion, Congress, First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, the very First Amendment, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or abridging freedom of the press or freedom of the individuals to peaceably assemble and petition the government with their grievances, something like that. Don't have it all memorized. But the idea was that in the new civilization that was emerging in the aftermath of the overthrow of feudalism, individuals would have rights. People could pick their own religion. People could say what was on their mind. People, could start businesses and engage in economic activities. And, Thomas Jefferson, if you read his writings, he really emphasized this. He said the ideal society was for yeomen. He called them yeomen, independent small farmers who have their own land and work their own land, and the government doesn't bother them. You read Thomas Jefferson's writings, he's always writing about the yeoman. It's this idyllic image of America as a country of self-made men, farmers who work the land and no one gives them anything, but they did it all themselves. They earned it by the sweat of their brow, and no one gets in their way. There's not big taxation taking away their wealth. They're hard-working men. That was very much the ideal, right? When you talk about the rights of man, when you talk about life, liberty, and property, as John Locke put it, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, as was put by Thomas Jefferson, these are all more or less, these are all the beginning of liberalism. And it was an advance over feudalism, right? It was an advance. It said, your own life is your own, right? You have freedom. Okay. Evolutionary. Wrote it down. Very good question. So liberalism emerged as this ideology that celebrates the individual. And it is an advance, right? I think people should be able to pick their own religion. I think people should be able to speak their mind and say what they believe. I think people should be able to pick their own job. This is a good. Individual rights are generally a good thing. Individual rights are a step above feudalism, where people don't have individual rights. Liberalism was an advance. And let's point out one thing, and this is very important. Before we get a little further on this, I want to make this point. Jordan Peterson, lobsters, you can learn everything you need to know about humans from lobsters. I'm Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson, in so many of his videos, he says that hierarchy is natural. Look at the lobsters. They have hierarchies, lobsters. He says hierarchies, social hierarchies, are natural and that they are in our DNA. Lobsters have social hierarchies. There's the top dog lobster. And based on that, you shouldn't try to correct social inequality, he argues. Some people are just naturally better than others. And he talks about this 80-20 rule. Some people are just naturally superior to others. When you try to make things equal, it ruins everything, he argues, because humans are just naturally have hierarchies. Well, there's a problem with that, which is, yes, it is in our DNA to create hierarchies. Human beings definitely have in our DNA the ability to create hierarchies. Do you know what we also have in our DNA? We also have the ability to run. Did you know that? Running is in our DNA. It's something that comes naturally. No one has to teach you how to run. You just do it. It's in your DNA. But do you run all day long? Do you go out and run every 24-hour days? Of course not. You run when you need to. Running is in your DNA, but you don't do it all the time. And hierarchies, yes, are in our DNA, but hierarchies change throughout history. The hierarchy that existed in hunter-gatherer tribes, where the elders might have, there might be respect for the elders, there might be respect for the swiftest hunters, but everyone's basically the tribe of 20 or 30 people. The hierarchy that exists in feudalism, where you have the king with his divine right and the pope, and then you have the local noble and the peasant, that's one form of hierarchy, right? The hierarchy that exists today, where we have those who have lots of wealth and money and power, and they're considered the rulers. Hierarchy changes throughout human history. There's no natural hierarchy. There's no natural, deeply ingrained, sacred, eternal way. Hierarchy changes based on social conditions. Humans do create hierarchies naturally when they need to, but they create them out of necessity to serve different purposes. And as our mode of production changes, as we go from hunter-gatherer civilization to feudalism, as we go from feudalism to capitalism, as we go from capitalism to socialism, the nature of the hierarchy is constantly evolving and adapting and changing. Why? Because society is changing, because the mode of production is changing, because the way we interact with our environment is changing. And that's what Jordan Peterson doesn't get. And that's also what Joe Biden doesn't get. No one in the world was talking about the rights of man or freedom of religion or freedom of expression until like the 1400s in Europe. And why was that? Were people just evil until then? People were just inherently evil until John Locke came along and said, I have a revelation. We should have freedom of religion. We should have freedom of speech. And everyone's like, yeah, that's a good idea. I can't believe no one ever thought of that before. Of course not. People weren't evil until the 1400s. But they had never reached a mode of production that would enable a society to function in that way. You couldn't have freedom of expression or freedom of religion in medieval Europe on the economic basis that they had, with the very low life expectancy, with subsistence farming. Forget about it. The reason that the hierarchies of the feudal times existed wasn't just because there were people being mean to other people. It was because the mode of production necessitated that level of cohesion in society. Hierarchies are about getting people to pull together and obey each other and have discipline to get shit done. And as more abundance is created in society, as more abundance emerges, there becomes less of a need for that kind of cohesion. You can loosen things up. In hunter-gatherer civilization, there was almost no individuality of any kind. Nowadays, there's a huge amount of individuality. It's because we've reached a higher mode of production. Society has loosened up to some degree or other. And you'll notice that when a country is at war, freedoms tend to disappear. When the U.S. Congress declares war officially, like they did in World War II and World War I, freedom of expression goes away. Freedom of assembly goes away. Why? Because it's a time of war, and freedoms are put on hold during a time of war. In countries that are deeply impoverished and have a huge amount of chaos, they don't have the same level of freedom as we enjoy in the West. And furthermore, as our country, the United States, is becoming less and less stable politically, as the living standard is dropping, as there is more instability among the population, you'll notice our freedoms are starting to disappear. The government is doing things that it didn't used to do, right? We're seeing more erosion of our civil liberties in response to the deteriorating economic situation and the deterioration of stability in society. And there is a direct correlation. Freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, all of these things are directly related to the economic base. That is the reality. This is historical materialism, and this is so important. This is so important because without this, you're stuck in a confused, idealist, liberal worldview. It's really important to understand all of this, that you cannot separate freedom. You cannot separate, the political system from the economic situation, from the mode of production. This is all very, very important. And that the worldview that we're all given, that there's freedom and then there's brutal authoritarian regimes that violate freedom. America is great because it had freedom. Everyone was just evil until they realized the founding fathers and their great idea that we should all have freedom. This is all bunk. This is all bullshit, right? Freedom and democracy is based on a certain level of production existing. And this is a really important thing for people to understand. But that gets me to the point about how we're living in a society crisis of liberalism. So liberalism says that the individual should come before all else. Liberalism began as a lifting of the restrictions of feudal society. Began by telling people, no, you're allowed to pick your own religion. No, you can criticize the government if you want to. No, it was lifting of restrictions on people. That's how it started. But it continued. Liberalism increased. And liberalism was and is very much the ideology of Western civilizations. The individual becomes the most sacred thing. It's all about the rights of the individual. In terms of economics, this means free markets. The government should just take its hands off corporations, let corporations do what they want. Corporations have no obligation to society. The business community should be able to just pursue their profits as much as they can. The free market, neoliberal economics, this is economic liberalism taken to its logical conclusion. And it's being taken to ridiculous conclusions. The Constitution of the United States says you need a post office. Why do you need a post office? Well, you need a post office because of the fact that that in order to have the economy function, in order to have a society, you need people to be able to send letters and to be able to send packages. And you can't have it be a private corporation, because then a private corporation might favor other corporations. So according to the U.S. Constitution, it is the duty of the state to facilitate something called the post office, to make sure that we have mail in the country. And that's not because the U.S. government is somehow socialist. That's because of the fact that to facilitate the market, you need a state sector. But you'll notice they are now trying to break apart the post office, even though it was just considered common sense when the country was founded. And up until now, it's just been common sense that we need a post office. There has now become an effort to say, why do we really need a post office? Couldn't we have FedEx do it? Couldn't we have American Express? Couldn't we have UPS? Why do we need a post office? It's happening. They are actively starting to say we don't really need a post office. We can have a private company do it. Well, there's no one would have ever thought of that. But economic liberalism has gotten to such an extreme. Another example, the military. At the time the country was founded, it was considered just common sense. Well, we're going to have a military, and the military is going to be made up of the government. And it's going to be people that are hired and paid and trained, maybe conscripted by the government to wage our wars, to carry out national defense. But you'll notice that in the last couple decades, they've said, who says we have to have an army that's by the government? What about Blackwater? What about Academy Blackwater? Why don't we have private military contractors? They could do it. Okay. Writing it down. Why don't we have private military contractors? Why don't we have private military contractors? Who says the government has to run the military? A private for-profit corporation would do it better, right? The public education system. Now, originally, that was not part of the United States. It was only as a result of years of struggle, really, and also as a result of the German Kaiser that we have public education. It used to be some states had public provided education, et cetera, but it wasn't really until the lead up to World War I that in the lead up to World War I, as German imperialism was emerging to become a rival with American and British imperialism, they noticed that one of the strengths of German imperialism was that every German child went to kindergarten, and learned to march. And under the German Kaiser, under pre-World War I Germany, children all went to this thing called a public school. And at the public school in Germany, they learned to march in line and in formation. They learned to sing Deutschland, Deutschland über all, and that German imperialism had a very effective military, mainly because it had a very effective public school system. And the British imperialists and the American imperialists looked at this and they said, well, shit, if we're going to fight the German imperialists, we got to do the same thing over here. And you didn't really get universal public education in the United States until it was realized that it was necessary. But it was created. And, around 1900 or so, we started to have universal compulsory education in the United States, mainly because the Germans did it first. And the Germans did it as a result of struggle on the part of the German Social Democratic Party. The German Social Democrats, the Marxists, were demanding the right to public education. And then the German Kaiser adopted it and then began using it for military purposes. It's a whole nother story there, right? And there were protests, in the United States around the right to a public education too, right? The labor movement was demanding that. But regardless, we got a public education system. But recently, they've come up with this idea of charter schools. Who says the government has to run the schools? Why don't we just have private corporations? Why don't we just have schools for profit? Schools for profit would be better, right? I mean, it's always better if a private corporation does this. Economic liberalism, the idea that the government shouldn't be involved in the economy, has been taken to ridiculous extremes in the United States. Private prisons, private military contractors, privatizing and destroying the post office. These are things that the founders of capitalism would never have dreamed of, but they are consistent with their ideology. The liberal ideology says individual above all else. Economic liberalism or neoliberalism says the market is always better. So this is economic liberalism being taken to its logical conclusion, right? We're saying that that the Soviet Union fell. That proves that socialism and communism are always a failure, right? We're proving that the Western liberal free market way is the best. So we're applying the Western liberal free market way of doing things in the most crazy, extreme ways. Privatizing education, privatizing the military, getting rid of post office. This is insanity. Right? We don't have a national health care service. Every other Western industrial country has a national health service or Medicare for all or something. We don't have that here, right? This is, again, I got muted for no reason. Oh, okay. All right. This is Western liberalism taken to its logical conclusion. So another form of liberalism is, of course, social liberalism. And social liberalism is not the same as economic liberalism. Social liberalism is the idea that you don't have any obligation to society. You have no obligation to your family. You have no obligation to your country. You have no obligation to your community. You're on your own. And social liberalism has meant, for example, gay marriage, right? And I'm for gay marriage. I believe in gay marriage, but it's social liberalism. It says you're not obligated to have your adult romantic relationship be the way it's traditionally done. If you want to marry another man or you want to marry another woman, you can do that. That's social liberalism, right? It's breaking apart this obligation that everyone has to get married and have a family structure in the traditional way. We've gotten rid of that. We said, if you want to structure your family in a different way, you can do that. That's your business. That's social liberalism. But in addition to that, there are other expressions of social liberalism. Drugs, right? Drug use is something people generally say shouldn't be done. People shouldn't be using drugs. It's not good for society. They become addicts and it's not a good thing. Well, now we're starting to say, you know what? If you want to use drugs, that's your business. Now, I don't think anyone should go to jail for using drugs, but I also don't think drug use should be promoted. We as a society should recognize that drug use is not a good thing. However, that's changing. People are saying drugs are just the way things are. And this social stigma around drug use, this feeling that we should help people get off of drug, that's going away, right? And hallucinogens are being promoted and everyone's using drugs, right? This is social liberalism. Left-wing people tend to be more in favor of social liberalism. Right-wing people tend to be more in favor of economic liberalism. But liberalism, the individual above all else, is the prevailing ideology of Western civilization. We believe in individualism. And it's gotten to the point that when you hear leaders talk, often they will refer to individuals or they'll refer to the entire human race. But listen, when they're talking at the European Union, when they're talking at the G20, When they're talking at the World Economic Forum, listen, they will talk about individuals and they will talk about all of the human race, but they'll never talk about the American people. They'll never talk about the working class. They will never talk about groups of people. They talk about all of humanity, or they talk about the individual person. They never speak of groups. And there's an active effort to break down any sense of group loyalty. And social media is very good at that. Social media pulls up any disagreement you could have with somebody. It immediately highlights it. And Western society is taking the liberal ideology to its conclusion, breaking everyone down into atomized individuals. It's you against the world. You've got your individual Facebook. You've got your individual Twitter. You have got your own brand, and you have no obligation to anybody else. And everyone else is kind of scary. And you should be very afraid of everyone else. And pretty soon, we're all alone. And the pandemic, why do you think mental health went crazy during the pandemic? Because people couldn't gather. They couldn't get together in groups. And human beings are social creatures. Human beings, everything human beings do is collective. All those innovations that human beings created that got us out of hunter-gatherer civilization, that got us out of the dark ages, all of them were collective innovations. All of them were things people did in groups. You know, you look at the cathedrals of old Europe. Those cathedrals took more than a human's life expectancy to build. There were people who worked on those cathedrals, set the stones, carved the sculptures that never saw the finished product. And they knew they would never see it. They knew it would be done long after they were dead, but they still did it because it was going to be a collective achievement. They thought, I want my country, my city, my civilization to build this beautiful cathedral. It's not going to be finished. Before I'm dead. I'm going to spend my whole life working on this cathedral, and I'm going to be dead, and it's still not going to be done, but they still worked on it because there was a collective vision. Human beings in their essence are collective. When a baby is born, it can't do anything on its own. It needs to be taken care of. It can cry and shit on its own. That's it. Everything else, eating, everything else, it needs another person for. Human beings are inherently collective creatures, but liberalism says otherwise. Liberalism says, no, you're not. You're simply an atomized individual. And liberalism is very, very convenient for the rich and powerful because historically, it is collective action that beats them back. The labor movement, unions, right? There's an old union song. It goes like this. Step by step, the longest march can be won. Many stones can form an arch, but singly none. And by union, what we will can be accomplished still. Drops of water turn a mill. Singly none. The whole labor movement was getting workers on the job to realize that they had a collective interest. And if they put their tools down and demanded higher pay for the employer would have to give in to their needs. The labor movement, historically, was about collectivism. Why do you think they call it collective bargaining? The mass movements that have existed historically have been populist movements, the broad masses of people making demands on the rich and powerful. But the ruling elite of our time, they want you to be an atomized individual. And they've set up all kinds of mechanisms to try and keep you to be an atomized individual. And a big part of that is Netflix. Netflix is liberal propaganda, not Democratic Party propaganda. It is the ideology of liberalism. It's designed to make you afraid to be in a group of other people? How many documentaries do they have about cults? Cults, 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 cults. Everything's a cult. Everything's a cult, right? Singing. If a group sings together, that's a cult. If a group chants together, it's a cult. You know, every sporting event I've ever been to where the crowd is cheering, that's a cult. Every church where they sing hymns together, that's a cult, right? Liberalism is all about freedom of mind. Think for yourself. I used to go out and leaflet. I'd hand out socialist and communist leaflets. And so many people refused to take the leaflet from me because, quote, I think for myself. And I would think, if you think for yourself, why are you threatened to read this leaflet? Oh, I'm afraid I might read something in this leaflet that would challenge, it would cause me to not think for myself. If you think about it, think for yourself is an excuse for not thinking at all. Right? Most Americans can't find their home country on a map. Did you know that? Most Americans cannot find the United States on a map. Go around the United States and ask Americans to find which country we're bombing currently. Right? And they can't find it on a map. Americans can't find North Korea on a map. Americans can't find Iraq on a map. They can't find Libya on a map. But yet we're told that all those young people in Venezuela with their red berets and their fist salutes that are pledging allegiance to Hugo Chavez and Maduro and the Bolivarian Revolution, they're brainwashed, right? All those red guards and young pioneers in China with their red scarves around their neck and we're saluting and pledging that they will live and die for communism in China. They are all brainwashed, right? All the Islamic youth of Iran that are pledging to fight for the Islamic Revolution and defeat Zionism and U.S. imperialism, they're all brainwashed. But you know what? Every single one of those Iranian youth, every single one of those Venezuelan youth, every single one of those youth from China, they can find their country on a map. They can find their country on a map. But we Americans, we're free thinking. We think for ourselves. No one tells us how to think. I can't take your leaflet, Caleb. I can't take your leaflet. I'm too busy thinking for myself. All of those people, they're free thinking, we're told. And they can't find their country on a map. This is the reality. This is liberalism taken to its insane, logical conclusion. This is the death agony of liberalism. Individualism above all else. No one has any obligation to their family. No one has any obligation to society. No one has any obligation to the country. No one has any obligation to religion or any higher power. No one, no business has any obligation to work in the benefit of society, to just pursue their own profits. And everyone is an atomized individual. You're your own brand against the world. That is the logic of liberalism. And it's very effective. Essentially, they don't want any middleman. They want all of the brainwashing and all the ideological training to come from this. They want you to get programmed by the algorithms, by Twitter, by Facebook, by YouTube. That's what they want. They want to be able to program your mind. And they don't want your religion to get in the way. And they don't want your community to get in the way. They don't want your family to get in the way. They don't want your group of friends to get in the way. They don't want a political organization to get in the way. They don't want anything to get in the way. They want 100% access to your brain. Your brain belongs to them and no one else. And they get to program you with their algorithms. They get to program you with Facebook and Twitter and social media. And anything that gets in the way is evil brainwashing. Anything that gets in the way is a cult. Anything that gets in the way is totalitarianism. You're thinking for yourself as you scroll through YouTube. You're thinking for yourself as you scroll through Facebook. I'm thinking for myself. Look, it's my Facebook. It's my Twitter. You're thinking for yourself. That's what they want. Break down any bond that connects people to others, break down any higher truths, any loyalty, any social, anything, and then let them have 100% access to you as an atomized individual that they can control. Let them tell you how to think as you think you're thinking for yourself, as they sell you an identity, a commodified identity, as they say, oh, you're a this. Well, we're going to sell you this shoes and this shirt and these pants. We're going to show you this videos to watch as they sell you your identity, as they program you to think what they want with their algorithms, as they break you off and isolate you from any support or anyone who might get in the way of their operations. That's what they want. And is it any surprise that we're having a mass crisis of mental illness in our society? Is it any surprise that suicides are through the roof? Is it any surprise that drug addiction is through the roof? Is it any surprise that young people don't know what to believe in? Is it any surprise that we're breaking apart? Human beings have always needed ideology. Even back in hunter-gatherer civilization, they had ideology. They worshipped Mother Goddess or something like that. They had rituals. You look at the cave paintings. People had ideology back then. In feudalism, the ideology was the ideology of the Catholic Church in Europe, right? The ideology, even Western capitalist countries had ideology for a long time. Until recently, Americans believed they lived in the greatest country in the world, and that America was the home of the free, the land of the brave, the home of the brave, the land of the free, and they were fighting for American values. People had ideology. But now we've been told by YouTube and Netflix and Twitter, we've been told by George Soros, we don't need ideology anymore. Ideology is totalitarian. If anyone tells you that right and wrong exists, they're trying to brainwash you. You're a sucker, right? If anyone tells you there's a cause worth fighting for or dying for, they're an evil, totalitarian, authoritarian system. You can't have that. We are being told that there is no truth, that there's nothing worth living for. We're basically being told that there is no point in life. And I've made this analogy a million times, but I'm going to say it again. Ideology is like driving a car. If you're driving down the road, you know where you came from, you know where you're going, you know how you're getting there, and you're driving down the road. But what they are doing right now, what the Silicon Valley fascists, what the bankers and billionaires and oil monopolists, the technocrats that sit at the center of this empire, the international oligarchy, what they are doing right now is this. Imagine that you're driving down the road and suddenly you don't know where you came from. And suddenly you don't know where you're going. Suddenly you don't know how you're getting there. What are you going to do? You're going to stop the car. You're going to panic and stop the car. If you're driving down the road and you don't know where you're going, you don't know where you came from, you don't know how you're getting there, you're going to stop the car. That's what they're doing right now. They are stopping the car. They've stripped away all ideologies. They've stripped away all ideology. They've said that truth doesn't exist. They've told people there is no point in life. And then they wonder why civilization comes apart. This all started during the Cold War. It actually started during the Korean War. During the Korean War, there were a number of American GIs who got taken prisoner. They became prisoners of war. And they were taken to China. They were fighting against the communists on the Korean Peninsula, and they were taken to China. And in the prisoner of war camps in China, they confessed to war crimes, to killing the Korean people. Many of them became communists. And they started broadcasting messages over the radio, urging other soldiers to surrender and stop killing the Korean people. And the American Central Intelligence Agency lost their minds. How can this be happening? How can these good American boys from Iowa and Kansas and Idaho and Texas who've gone to fight the commies in Korea, how can they possibly be confessing to war crimes, saying that Mao and Kim Il-sung are good people, praising Stalin? This can't be happening. What's going on? And that's why in the 1950s, suddenly a new word came into Americans' vocabulary: brainwashing. They called it brainwashing. There was a movie called The Manchurian Candidate that came out. And suddenly the CIA started doing all kinds of research, trying to figure out how the hell was it? How the hell was it that Americans could become communists? They figured, the Korean communists, the Chinese communists, they must have some magic voodoo. They must be like casting magical spells, right? There's an old racist anti-Asian movie called Fu Manchu about this evil Chinese magician. It's really racist, but it's like this evil Chinese magician who has these magical powers. That's what they thought was going on. They thought that there must be some like magical Chinese voodoo that Mao, he gets the American soldiers in a cell, and he goes, "You will hate America. You will hate America. You will be communist. You will be communist." And they went, "Yes, must hate America. Must be communist. Yes, yes." That's what they did. And Project MK Ultra, the CIA's brainwashing program, was all about them trying to figure out what this voodoo, this magical voodoo that American communists were being American GIs were being turned into communists with. But the more they researched it, they realized there was no such thing. There was no voodoo. Basically, what it was, these guys, they were true believers. They were hardcore, super patriotic Americans who thought America never did nothing wrong. America never did anything wrong. They loved their Uncle Sam. They were super patriotic. And so they would get them in they'd been captured. They'd be in the jail. They would sit them down and they'd show them, a picture of lynching. Remember lynching? Where black men were dangled from trees and had their bodies mutilated by crowds of people that would cheer. They'd show them pictures of lynching and say, "This is what America does to black people." And of course, these good American GIs would say, "That's not true. That's a lie. That's communist propaganda. America would never do such a thing." And then they would bring them the New York Times. And then they would bring them testimony from the United Nations about how America treats black people. And then they would show them that, yes, indeed, America does do horrendous things. And then after a while, and these soldiers would be isolated in a cell, after a while, they would break. They would crack. Right? If you're isolated in a cell, the only person you're seeing is your interrogator, they called it, right? And he keeps bringing you more and more evidence to show you that indeed America does evil things around the world. And you have a very, very naive and blindly patriotic view that America never does anything bad. Well, after a couple weeks of being alone in that cell, and after a couple weeks of evidence being shown to you, you're going to develop Stockholm syndrome. You're going to be sympathetic, right? Bourgeois equality. You're going to become sympathetic to the person who's your interrogator because they're the only other people in your life, first of all. Second of all, you're just going to be relentlessly confronted with the reality, and they would crack. And they would start crying and realize that, yes, America did, lynch black people. Yes, America did kill civilians during the Korean War. And then once they cracked, they would put them in a cell with a bunch of other communists and give them communist literature. And then these guys would be communists. But it didn't work on all of them. It worked on a few of them. Didn't work on all of them. And who did it work on? It worked on the guys who were the true believers. It worked on the guys who thought America was infallible. But who did it not work on? The guys who'd been to university, the guys who already knew about lynching, the guys who were already a little bit cynical about America and realized that America was corrupt. Didn't work on them. Why? Because they had a shades of gray view. Right? If you have a light switch mindset where everything's good or evil, it doesn't take much to turn the light on or off. Right? These guys thought America, if America is all good and infallible, all you have to do to convince somebody to, become all in against America is prove to them and force them to recognize that America has flaws. And it worked. Right? These GIs, they became all in communists. But the ones who were already cynical, the ones who already knew America had problems, the ones who had, were somewhat critical of the United States, were aware of its flaws, didn't work on them. The CIA realized this. And so if you look at the process, the rise of what they call Cold War liberalism was a result of MK Ultra. They said, if we're going to defeat the communists, we've been going about it all wrong with McCarthyism. All wrong with McCarthyism. We've been doing it all wrong with McCarthyism. In McCarthyism, it was the communists are all bad, and the Americans and Christianity and truth, justice, and the American way is all good. They said, we've been doing that all wrong. Right? Among black people who are oppressed and discriminated against and living under Jim Crow, there's already growing interest in communism because they're facing oppression. And the Communist Party, has organized the Civil Rights Congress. They sent William L. Patterson to the United Nations. So, already there's growing interest in communism among groups of society that are marginalized because they're mad at the power structure. And if there were a new economic crisis, if the U.S. economy had another Great Depression, there's a very good chance the whole country would become communists. CIA said, this isn't going to work. What we need is that cynicism. What we need is to get everyone cynical. And actually, I wish I had the book in front of me. But in the book, The Search for the Manchurian Candidate, a very good book, an expose about Project MKUltra. One of the things they describe is how when they got people on drugs, on LSD, they would suddenly stop believing in right and wrong. And they would start believing that everything was a matter of opinion. And that this coincided with the fact that they were hallucinating and they didn't know what was real and what was not real. When you are on a hallucinogen, you're seeing things that are not there. You're hearing things that are not there. You're having feelings that are not there, right? Often people who take LSD feel like they have to pee and they don't, right? And, it's weird things like that. It just throws off all your senses. And they realize when they put people on hallucinogens, they suddenly felt like there was nothing worth living for. There was nothing worth dying for. They couldn't tell what was real and what wasn't. They were just disoriented. And that became the new strategy for defeating communism. Instead of building up the American way and capitalism as the one true way and communism is the enemy, the strategy became disorientation. Get everybody confused. Get everyone saying there is no truth. Get everyone saying it's all just a matter of opinion. And not just in the United States. Oh, not just in the United States. Spread this into the communist countries. Don't spread anti-communist propaganda into the communist countries. Don't go into the communist countries and say America is great and communism's evil. No. Bring LSD into the communist countries. Bring Beatles rock and roll music into the communist countries. Bring postmodern philosophy into the communist countries. While we gradually get everyone in the United States to do your own thing, man, and just, chill out and use some drugs, we can also spread that cynicism and confusion into the Soviet Union and into the Eastern Bloc. And this was liberalism taken to its ultimate conclusion. It was a snake. It was like a big, wild snake, a poisonous snake that they used to defeat communist and leftist movements, to replace them with the synthetic left, with the Frankfurt School, with Susan Sontag, with the Congress for Cultural Freedom. It was a poisonous snake that they unleashed and used to bring down the Soviet Union, to bring down the Eastern Bloc. But this snake has turned around and has crawled back into the United States. And liberalism is breaking apart America. And we're seeing it. The liberalism that they themselves cultivated. They looked at the Soviet Union. They said this ideological state, the Communist Party leading it, that's pushing ideology, that says there is universal truth, Marxism, Leninism, that's training people to fight and die for their ideology. We'll insert postmodernism into the Soviet Union. We'll insert postmodernism into Western Europe. We'll get everyone to be cynical. We'll get everyone to believe that maybe not. We'll insert that over there, and that'll rip apart these quote unquote totalitarian societies. That'll rip it apart, and it worked. But now that snake has crawled right back to the United States and is ripping apart the United States, and it's ripping apart the West. The snake they invented to defeat communism, to defeat socialism and Marxism, has crawled right back. And now we're facing a huge societal crisis. Good question. How did Lenin improve on Marx, revise Marxist theories? How did Mao improve on and imprise on Marx and Lenin's theories? Very good question. And that's the crisis that we're in as a society. It is the crisis of liberalism. And what is ultimately going to happen is we're going to see the triumph of illiberalism. Now that we're faced with an economic crisis that has already compounded and made worse the social crisis, the breakdown of liberalism, Western capitalism is going to break down into some form of illiberalism in order to stabilize the economy, in order to end the social chaos and instability. Western civilization, the United States absolutely included, is going to break down into illiberalism. Now, whether this is fascist illiberalism, whether this is some bizarre new form of illiberalism we've never seen, or whether ultimately this leads to what we want, which is the USA moving toward socialism and joining with the new economy, the Belt and Road Initiative and the Eurasian Economic Union, we don't know. And I think we have a role to play in it. I mean, the actions that we take are not immaterial. There's a reason Trevor Loudon referenced me and said I'm influencing Tulsi Gabbard. The actions that we take have an influence, but ultimately, in order to keep society together, some kind of illiberalism is going to emerge from the death agony of liberalism in Western society. Organism. So I guess that's the point I wanted to make. We got a lot of super chats. We got 4 left over from earlier today, and then we got a lot more that people have added. More are always welcome. More super chats is always good. But that's what I want people to understand. Those are my opening remarks for tonight. We are living in the death agony of liberalism. This is liberalism and postmodernism in utter decay, ripping apart a civilization amid a capitalist economic crisis. And this is the deck of cards we've been handed. And this is the situation that we're in. And it gives us a unique historical opportunity to play a role as we transition. So there you go. I hope you learned something from my opening remarks. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. I would really appreciate it if you could hit the notifications bell. And on top of that, as I said at the beginning, I'm trying to rebuild the Patreon. So if you're part of the Patreon community, please consider shooting us a, joining on Patreon. There's 9 people watching on Rockfin right now. Shout out to all of you. I haven't forgotten about you. But yeah, if you want to join the Patreon, we are going to have a patrons only stream in the next 10 days. So there you go. So let's do the roll call. Let's find out who's on the other side. Who is on the other side of the camera? Names and locations. Names and locations. I will call you all out as I see you. Who's with us tonight? Names and locations. Names and locations. All right, we got Bradley Wasser in St. Louis. We got Dylan Small. Shout out to Dylan in California. Dylan's awesome, by the way. I got a book that about a relative of his on the shelf behind me. Rice from Adelaide, Australia. Fred from Alameda. Ishmael in Los Angeles. Anthony from Fort Worth, Texas. Pete from California. Jared from Virginia. Thomas from Virginia. Evelyn in Hillsboro, Oregon. Edwin, Seattle. Jenny Lynn from Cincinnati, Combate in New England, Mr. in Kansas. We got Nelson from San Antonio, Texas. We got Australia, Richard Thunder. We got Tristan in Maryland, Parasocialite. Welcome, Tristan. You're awesome. Good to have you here. Jim in Harrisburg. We got Auckland, New Zealand. We got Bob Troy in New York. Colin in Greensboro. We got Hannibal in Singapore. We got Long Beach, California. We got Kieran from San Diego is with us. Welcome, welcome. We got Viking Dave in Michigan. We got Tomas from German State Socialism. We've got Hens from South Africa, Puerto Rico, Jake from NYC, Christian from Bergen County, New Jersey. We got Richland, Woodland, and Richland. Henko from South Africa. Welcome, everybody. So good to have you. Caleb, we got another Caleb from Ypsilanti. That's in Michigan. I've been to Ypsilanti before. Not many people would know where Ypsilanti is. I do. Carter is in Duluth, Minnesota, right? We got Minden out in Midwest, Olympia Logic, great friend of our community. We got Kendall in San Diego. We got Oakland, California, Psyop Shorty. We got Caitlin from Chicago. Greetings. Well, shout out to you, Caitlin. So glad to have you here. Shout out to you. Micah in Las Vegas. A Better America, Northern Michigan. Oh, good stuff. Tyler in Missouri. Great to have you. Lionel from Melbourne. Lionel's out in Melbourne, Australia. Long Island, New York. Ventos. We got Max Wells out in Tennessee. We got Wellington in New Zealand. We got Clyde in Melbourne. We got Wellington in New Zealand. Oh, wow. This is great. Who else is here with us tonight? We got Savannah, Georgia, DW. We got who else? We got other folks here. This is great. I'm just watching them as they come into my streaming platform, right? We got Patrick from Los Angeles. Welcome, Patrick. Nate from Chicago, Windy City. Very good stuff. Very, very good stuff. Good stuff. It's too late for unnamed diet beverage, but I'm drinking regular unnamed water beverage at the moment. Got to work out today. That was great. With all the moving and relaunching everything, I haven't been working out, but today I did a whole hour at the gym. That felt great. I'm going to be back at the gym tomorrow. It's very, very good. Very good to go exercise. Today I things were a little slower with work, so I was able to go exercise. That was really, really good. We did our stream in the afternoon. I went and exercised, ate some lunch, came back. Good stuff. Paul Allen from New York City. Good stuff. Regular, everyday, normal water vervices. All right. Very, very good. Very, very good. Very, very good. I am not an athlete, by the way. I work out simply for my health. So there you go. There you go, folks. All right. So now we have a number of super chats to get through, but that's okay because they're all good. And we're going to get through all of them. The first super chat is 1848, European history. 1848 was the Spring of Nations. And that was when all across Europe, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, I think I read somewhere that there were 200 different uprisings in Europe in the year of 1848. There was an uprising in France. There was an uprising in Germany, the German Revolution of 1848 that Wagner participated in, that Marx and Engels participated in. There was an uprising in Belgium and in Hungary. There was uprisings. I believe there was uprisings like Catholic uprisings in Britain, if I'm not mistaken. 1848 was the year that Europe shook. There were revolutions all across Europe. They called it the Spring of Nations because the main demand of the various uprisings was the creation of modern nation states. Nationalism was the ideology. It was the demand that instead of having feudal principalities, instead of having feudalism and local governments, they wanted a modern nation state and a modern government. The anthem of the 1848 German Revolution, I already sang it on here once. Deutschland, Deutschland, über alles. Deutschland, über all das Welt. That was the anthem of the 1848 German Revolution. And it was progressive at the time. They were demanding the creation of a German nation state, and they were defeated. The 1848 German Revolution was defeated. It was defeated by the counter-revolution. And Marx fled and went into exile, and so did Wagner, and so did a lot of people. In fact, Ohio and Pennsylvania, the reason there are so many Amish people in Pennsylvania and Ohio is because the Amish were a sect that was part of the 1848 revolution in Germany, right? The Anabaptists that believed you should not baptize babies. I've talked about them in previous streams. You know, also the first communists to come to America, the first Marxists, I guess, were what they called the Red 48ers. And they were Germans who fled to the United States after being part of the German Revolution. And August Willich and Joseph Wedemeyer, the two communists who were leaders of the Union Army during the American Civil War. August Willich became a brigadier general. Joseph Wedemeyer led the Ohio 9th Infantry Regiment. Both of them were Red 48ers. They fled Germany because of the fact that they were part of the 1848 German Revolution, and they lost. The revolutions of 1848 had different forces involved in them. There were forces that wanted simply democratic rights and, elected government. There were forces that were committed to, in Germany especially, there were a lot of forces that wanted German unification. They wanted one German state. And in other parts of Europe and in Germany and elsewhere, there were forces that were committed to socialism. There were working class, labor-oriented forces. There were also religious factions. In many of the municipalities, there were uprisings by Protestants, right? Where you had governments that were Roman Catholic or aligned with the Catholic Church. You had Protestants taking up arms. That was a big part of the 1848 uprisings. But also you had in areas where the Catholic Church was being suppressed. And like in Britain, I believe there was it the Gordon? No, it wasn't the Gordon riots. That was that, or maybe it was the Gordon riots. I don't remember. But there were uprisings of Roman Catholics in Britain at the time because the government in Britain was anti-Catholic, was Protestant, and there were Protestants who took there were Catholics who took up arms in Britain. There were Catholics who took up arms in various countries where the Catholic Church was being suppressed. 1848 was the Spring of Nations, and interestingly, the Republican Party. Are folks familiar with the Republican Party? That would be the second largest political party in America, the Republican Party. Well, the Republican Party got its name from the Spring of Nations. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the Republican Party was started in 1852. And it was started as a party of small farmers, the Free Soilers. And I believe it was started in Iowa or Kansas, one of those states. And it was a new political party, a breakaway from the Whig Party. The Democratic Party was around, but the Whig Party existed. And there was a break from the Whig Party. And it was thoroughly opposed to polygamy and slavery. That's what their founding manifesto said. They opposed slavery and polygamy. And it was small farmers started a new party called the Republicans. And a number of former members of the Whig Party broke away and formed the Republican Party. Very interesting history there. All right, the Republican Party. And why were they called the Republican Party? Because the revolutionaries across Europe who rose up against feudalism and rose up demanding modern nation states, what were they called? They were called republicans. And often because they waved the red flag, which was the emblem of the French Revolution, right? In the French Revolution, the radicals, the Jacobins, and the people that were fired up, that were supporters of the French Revolution, they wore red berets. They called them red caps. That was the radicals of the French Revolution. They wore red hats. They were the red caps, right? And the red flag started being, waved during the French Revolution as well. As they had their red caps and they waved their red flags. They called the very poor people, the mobs of poor people that were part of the French Revolution, they called them the sans culottes, those without shoes, right? And the sans culottes of the French Revolution, they wore red caps and they waved red flags. And so the red flag became a symbol of the Republicans. And the most radical, the most radical among the 1848 revolutions, they called them the Red Republicans. They were the ones who believed the French Revolution was good because there was division in Europe. Not everyone thought the French Revolution was good. A lot of the founding fathers of the United States thought the French Revolution was too radical. Now some of them embraced it, but not all of them, right? But those who continued and wanted to continue the tradition of the French Revolution, they were called Red Republicans. They waved the red flag, and they were the Red Republicans. And the Republican Party used a red flag as its emblem, and it was the American Party that identified with the uprisings in Europe, with the Republican uprisings of 1848, right? That demanded democratic republics, that were talking about the rights of man, that wanted to get rid of slavery. The Republican Party was a radical third party, started in the United States by people who were inspired by the 1848 wave of revolutions across Europe. They saw that in Europe, all these people were rising up and overthrowing feudal monarchs and demanding modern nation states and wanting to get rid of slavery and serfdom. And they liked it. And so they formed a Republican Party. And who became the leader of the Republican Party? Why, it was a man from an unsettled territory, a new state, Illinois. It was a man named Abraham Lincoln. And they called him, he was a wild man from Illinois, from this state that was out. They called him, they had a song, Old Abe Lincoln Came Up from the Wilderness, right? And they had another campaign song, Lincoln and Liberty Too. And he was this populist. He was for the small farmers. And he was going to stop the slave plantation owners, the wealthy plantation owners who were in bed with Wall Street and who were in bed with London. He was going to stop them from kicking around the government. And he was going to fight for the little guy, for the small farmer, the free soilers, they were called, the people who settled Missouri, the people who settled Kansas, the people who settled Iowa. They were small farmers who didn't own any slaves, and they wanted to have their own land, and they wanted to be on their own, but they did not own any slaves, and they believed in freedom of religion, freedom of conscience, and they were against slavery. They thought slavery was barbaric, and, they wanted to form, they were the free soilers. They formed their own party, the Republican Party, and they rallied around Abraham Lincoln, this very, very tall lawyer who was a religious skeptic and who talked he gave speeches before the legislature in Illinois, and he talked about how the capitalists come together and fleece the people. And he talked about how labor is superior to capital. He said that human labor creates all wealth, and the job of government and all society is founded upon labor. Abraham Lincoln was a populist, if there ever was one. He was a populist, leading a party of small farmers, leading a movement that was against the big banks, leading a movement that was against the slave plantation owners, that was fighting for the little guy. Abraham Lincoln was from the wild, unsettled territory. He wasn't a coastal elite. He was from Illinois. He was a lawyer who had fought for women who were being abused by their husbands. He had fought for people, workers that were fighting their employers, and, poor people that were being sued by rich people. He had this record. He was a populist. And the Republican Party in the United States, its origins are very revolutionary. Go and watch Lincoln in Illinois. That's a great movie, a really good movie. Go watch Lincoln in Illinois. And it's a movie about Abraham Lincoln before he became president. And it came out during the Second World War. it's a patriotic movie, but it's a socialist movie, right? It's during the Roosevelt years, and it has John Brown in it, and it has Lincoln's fiery anti-racist speeches and speeches against slavery. And it shows him sticking up for labor unions, saying, "Thank God we live in a country where men have the right to go on strike." Go and watch Lincoln in Illinois, and you'll get an understanding of republicanism and the spirit of 1848 and the spirit that gave birth to the Republican Party and ultimately launched the Civil War in the United States. You know, the Civil War, it's been pointed out, the Civil War was probably the most progressive thing that the American bourgeoisie ever did. Never have the American capitalists been more progressive than when they defeated the slaveholders. And they have been running away from it ever since, right? It's like the best thing that the American capitalists ever did is they mobilized a great social revolution to defeat slavery. And almost immediately afterwards, well, give it a decade or so, they pulled all the troops out of the South and brought back Jim Crow. And then they've been making movies like Birth of a Nation and Gone with the Wind. And they've been doing everything they can to try and run away from this great progressive thing that they did. Reconstruction, where they were redistributing the land, the land of former slave owners. And, Reconstruction was a great moment. And the American bourgeoisie has spent a long time denigrating their most revolutionary moment. It's really embarrassing, but the American bourgeoisie are ashamed of what they did when they carried out the second great American Revolution, when Abraham Lincoln, the single-minded son of the working class, as Karl Marx called him, led the workers and the farmers of America to build a coalition to make Harriet Tubman the first woman ever to lead soldiers into battle. And what they did in the 1860s was amazing. The second American Revolution was a glorious moment in American history. And the bourgeoisie are ashamed of it. They're ashamed of it. They're not proud of it. They would like to denigrate and ignore what they did. Do you know much about how pro sports became propaganda for imperialism, Air Force flyovers, national anthems, etc.? Flyovers. All right. Very, very good. All right. So I could go on about that for months, but I'm not going to. Thoughts on the grain deal? Well, look, Russia is a huge producer of grain, a huge producer of fertilizer, and these sanctions on Russia are starving people. All right. Position on Grant. And these sanctions have resulted in food shortages. They've exacerbated the crisis of malnutrition in Africa that started with the pandemic. And Russia has been saying, by putting sanctions on us, by making it harder for us to export fertilizer, by not letting Russian ships dock around the world, you're exacerbating this. And so Russia negotiated this deal that in the middle of the Ukraine war, there would be a deal where they would be able to have grain be exported. And then the grain deal was violated. And there was an attack on the Russian fleet with drones. The Ukrainians got their drones together and they violated the deal. And it just shows that, and they're trying to blame Russia for the food crisis. Russia didn't put sanctions on itself. Russia wants to export their fertilizer. Russia wants to export its grain. Russia wants to do business with countries in the world. And it's the United States that has put unbelievable criminal sanctions on Russia to try and stop their fertilizer, to try and stop their grain from being exported. That's the U.S. imperialists who have done that. Russia would like to continue feeding the world. Russia would like to continue supplying fertilizer to the world. And the fact that they try to blame Russia for this, Russia's using food as a weapon. No, they're not. They're trying not to. And they're doing everything they can. They want a food crisis because they think there's too many people in the world. They openly talk about reducing consumption. Now, what do you call it when you reduce food consumption in Africa? When there's reduced food consumption in Africa, that's called a famine, right? They want a famine. They openly want a famine. They want to reduce consumption. That's what they want. They openly want it. They want to drive down the population. They want to reduce consumption. They want it. When Barack Obama went to Africa, he said if everyone on this continent had air conditioning and a car and a modern house, the environment would explode. That's what Barack Obama said. He said exactly what they think, right? They want people in Africa to starve. They want people in this country to starve, right? They think the problem isn't their system. They think the problem is that human beings breed too much. They want to hold back the wheels of history in order to preserve their system, because if the human race is going to keep marching ahead, it's going to have to break out of the dominance of Western monopoly capital. The only way for the humanity to march forward is for there to be development. The Belt and Road Initiative, One Belt, One Road Initiative, the Eurasian Economic Union, new infrastructure, power plants, etc. We're going to have to march forward. And they don't want that. They want the world to stay poor so that they can stay rich. And in order to do that, they are actively using this war to drive up energy costs and make a killing. You know, oil companies are making a killing right now. I mean, ExxonMobil, BP, Shell, and Chevron, the oil monopolists, they're sitting there saying, can we keep this war in Ukraine going as long as we can? This is awesome. Our competitor, Russia, is being isolated. The cost of gasoline is going up. We are making a killing. They are sitting there making a killing. They are making a killing, right? Oil monopolies are making a killing. So there you go. All right. The Buffalo shooter had friends in the Azov battalion. Well, yeah, he was wearing an emblem of the Azov battalion when he did his shooting. And it's unbelievable, right? It's unbelievable that, you know, I mean, it's like, you know, anytime you bring up the Nazi ties in Ukraine, they get mad, they get fired up. But could you imagine, what if one of these shooters was wearing the emblem of the Center for Political Innovation? You know, we would never hear the end of it. What if one of these shooters was wearing an I Love Putin shirt? We'd never hear the end of it. But this Buffalo shooter was wearing the sun, the fascist logo that is used by the Azov battalion in Ukraine. And it's like, oh, don't bring that up. Or if you bring it up, they say, oh, you're spreading Russian propaganda. Well, is it true or isn't it? Was he wearing that sun or wasn't he? He was, right? But because that's not politically convenient, because it doesn't fit their narrative, they don't play it up. It shows how biased things really are. All right. Next question. What were China-Soviet relations like after the death of Mao? They were not good. Chinese-Soviet relations first went sour in 1961. There were a number of documents published by the Chinese Communist Party criticizing Khrushchev. The first document, I believe, was directed at the Italian Communist Party. It was called The Differences Between Comrade Tagliati and Us. Then they published a document called Long Live Leninism. Then they published a document called Critique of the General Line of the International Communist Movement. And then they published a document called Khrushchev's Phony Communism and Its Lessons for the World. And the Chinese were calling out the Soviet Union for holding back the world revolution, calling them revisionists. In response, the Soviet Union cut off all their aid to China, left buildings half built, devastated China economically. China was referring to the Soviet Union as revisionists, betraying the cause of global revolution. But it wasn't until about 1969, 1970 that they started calling China imperialists, saying that the Chinese started calling the Soviet Union imperialists, calling them social imperialists. Socialist in word, but imperialists. They had restored capitalism, and they were the Soviet social imperialists. After Mao died, the anti-Soviet policies escalated. In fact, China's military intervention in Vietnam in 1978 during the Kampuchea War was very much anti-Soviet. China was supporting Cambodia and Pol Pot. The Soviet Union was supporting Vietnam. So China attacked Vietnam to defend Cambodia and Pol Pot against what they called Soviet social imperialism. And you had the Kampuchea War, where Pol Pot was being supported by China, and Deng Xiaoping sent the military to Vietnam to support Cambodia. And there was that, right? And then China, though, it's important to note that after Mao died and after the Gang of Four were arrested, Chinese foreign policy did shift a little bit. when China was under the Gang of Four, when they declared the Soviet Union to be imperialist, China only had relations with Albania, right? And then as Mao came out with what they called the theory of three worlds, China started aligning with countries they considered to be national capitalists. They aligned with Haile Selassie in Ethiopia. They aligned with the Shah of Iran. China recognized and was friendly with Pinochet. They aligned with, military regimes and juntas, Marcos in the Philippines and others that they thought were like strong allies, an ally of China against the Soviet Union. However, after the Gang of Four were arrested and after Deng Xiaoping came to power, China started having friendly relations with Poland and Romania and other Soviet-aligned countries. China started to have a relationship with governments around the world that were Soviet-aligned. They weren't friendly to the Soviet Union, but they started getting friendlier to Eastern European countries. They started getting friendlier to countries in the so-called Eastern Bloc or behind the Iron Curtain, and trying to pull these countries away from the Soviet Union. The USA, there's a number of, writings about Romania got into debt to American banks, and so did Poland. And Poland and Romania and a lot of those Eastern European countries started becoming more and more critical of the Soviet Union and getting loans from American banks. And as these countries would get more critical of the Soviet Union, China would get closer to them. And in the 80s, China was getting closer and closer to a number of what they called the satellite countries. And this was the strategy of Brzezinski. Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was Jimmy Carter's national security advisor. He was the head of the Cold War University, they called it, or the Center of Communist Studies at Columbia University. His whole thing was, in order to hurt the Soviet Union, we need to start kissing up to countries that are aligned with the Soviet Union and pulling them away from the Soviet Union. And that's what the Carter administration did. They did the Mariel boat lifts with Cuba. They Jimmy Carter sent his younger brother to go have wild drinking parties with Gaddafi. Billy Carter, Jimmy Carter's younger brother, was going and hanging out with Gaddafi. He became a lobbyist for the Libyan government, a registered foreign agent. And they were making big efforts to pull the quote unquote satellite countries that were aligned with the Soviet Union away from the Soviet Union. And you'll notice Gaddafi supported the Mujahideen and Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan. And China also supported the Mujahideen and Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union. And various countries that were part of the Eastern Bloc, part of the Soviet-aligned world, started to have distance from the Soviet Union. Ceausescu in Romania, the government in Poland. There's other examples of countries across Eastern Europe that had generally been in the Soviet camp were drifting away from the Soviet Union, and China would get friendly to them. And Deng Xiaoping would sit down and become more friendly with these leaders as they were drifting apart. China basically, they broke with the Soviet Union. They tried to be more revolutionary and more communist than the Soviet Union. They tried to have the Cultural Revolution. They tried to build a very, very egalitarian society in poverty. It didn't work. Didn't work well. And so then starting in like 1969, 1970, China started drifting into the U.S. camp in the Cold War. And it started out with, they said it was called the theory of three worlds. And it was Mao was still alive and embraced the theory of three worlds. They argued that they were the first world countries, the USA and the Soviet Union, and they were going to destroy each other in a nuclear war. And then there was the second world, which was Europe. And then there was the third world. And after the nuclear war destroyed the two major countries, right, then the third world would rise and China would lead the third world. And the non-aligned movement and the third world would lead, and China would be the leader of the third world. And so based on this theory of three worlds, based on that, China started aligning itself, making friends with various military strongmen backed by the United States that were anti-Soviet, arguing that these guys, because they were nationalists, because they were military strongmen, they weren't agents of the Soviet Union, and they could trade with China and help China develop, And when the nuclear war happened and took out the USA and the Soviet Union, then they would take China's leadership to develop. That was the theory of three worlds. After Mao died, they repudiated the theory of three worlds, and they started, basically, they were aligned with the United States during the Cold War, but they still were led by a communist party, and they started having friendly relations with various countries throughout the Soviet-aligned world that were starting to be distant from the Soviet Union. And that they were key. That was the role they played in the 80s. And then in 1989, right? 1989 is when the color revolution started happening. Czechoslovakia, East Germany, the governments of Eastern Europe that are taking out loans from the IMF and from American banks, that are having US-backed, protest movements that lead to the overthrow of the Communist Party. That's happening all across the Eastern Bloc, the color revolutions. In 1989, the summer of 1989, you had the Tiananmen Square events in China, where the same thing started happening, right? A bunch of, it started out as, again, Tiananmen Square. I mean, I can't tell this story enough. You've heard it from me before, it must be told. The Tiananmen Square events started as race riots. Look it up. Nicholas Kristof of the New York Times. A couple months before Tiananmen Square, before stuff started in June of 1989, in like the spring of 1989, they started having riots all over Chinese campuses. Chinese college campuses started having riots. Nicholas Kristof of the New York Times was there, and he wrote about them. And what were they? They were riots against black students. China was giving a lot of scholarships to black Africans to come to China to study. And anti-communist right-wing students that were in awe of America, and they hated black people, right? And so these Chinese students that were in awe of America and wanted American capitalism and wanted American consumer goods, they would riot against black students on their campuses. There'd be rumors, oh my God, one of these black men is dating a Chinese girl, and there was race riots on the Chinese campuses. Right. And the culmination of the race riots, was eventually led to the Tiananmen Square protests. And this is the New York Times admitted this. They started out as race riots. Right. And no one ever wants to talk about it. They're hippies marching for freedom and all that. Started out as race riots. So there were race riots on the Chinese campuses against African students. They started lynching African students, and like the Chinese military was going to have to rescue these African students from mobs of young, rich Chinese kids who were in awe of America. Started out as race riots. Then from there, they occupied Tiananmen Square, and they're just saying, they want democracy. Well, what does democracy mean? The word democracy is used in the Chinese constitution. Mao's revolution was called the New Democratic Revolution. Democracy is just a vague term. It means rule of the people. Started out with the college students who didn't like black people and liked America or whatever. Then the Maoists got involved, right? The hardliners, the Gang of Four Maoists got involved. And a lot of the workers in state-run factories who were seeing their living standards go down and their job security decreased by the market reforms, they started occupying the square. And then a couple sections of the military were in the square. And this is what happens in color revolutions. Color revolutions, it's about whatever, right? Anyone can project their grievance onto it. It doesn't matter if you're a racist or an advocate of Western capitalism or a neo-Maoist. They said there were more pictures of Mao in Tiananmen Square in 1989 than there had ever been since the Cultural Revolution. And it was about whatever. It was about everything. It was just chaos, right? It was American intelligence, George Soros and American intelligence fomenting chaos. And anyone who was mad about anything gathered in Tiananmen Square. Neo-Maoists, racists, wealthy college kids, everybody was there. It was chaos. And they sang the Internationale, and they erected a statue modeled after the Statue of Liberty, and there are pictures of Mao here. It was just a confused mess. A lot like Occupy Wall Street. It was a confused mess. What was Occupy Wall Street about? All day, all week, Occupy Wall Street. We are the 99%. It wasn't about anything, right? I was there. I was trying to make it about communism, but it was just as much about Ron Paul and libertarianism. It was just as much about Buddhism, just as much about animal rights. It's a clusterfuck. The CIA are very good at that, right? And, this is what happens when you have a color revolution. It's not about anything. It's just everyone who has any grievance, anyone who's upset about anything, you know, there'll be some vague thing about corruption, right? Or there'll be a color, orange, or a color in Iran, it's green, right? That's the symbol of the revolution. And it's about anything, right? And that's so they fomented chaos in Tiananmen Square, right? And then Deng Xiaoping got on TV and pointed out that there had been a bunch of bombings and assassinations on the other side of the city. And he said, we're declaring martial law in the city. The students peaceably dispersed. They didn't massacre them in the square. That's been confirmed again by Nicholas Kristof, by Bruce Miles, and now by WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks has leaked cables. There was no massacre in the square. There was killing elsewhere. The students peaceably dispersed from the square. That's a fact. There are multiple eyewitnesses, and U.S. media still maintains the massacre in Tiananmen Square. There was none. The students peaceably dispersed. And then, after the square was cleared, there was an armed uprising that went on in Beijing that went on for 2 weeks. And there were people on rooftops with sniper rifles, and there were people throwing fire bombs. And it was an all-out battle in the streets of Beijing between a faction, you know, some well-embedded pro-US, pro-free market capitalism factions within the Beijing government and the Chinese military. And the military from outside of Beijing was brought in, and they suppressed it. And then it was over. And a lot of innocent people died. That's true. There were a lot of civilians who died. There were also as many as possibly as 200 Chinese soldiers who died from the Chinese military, right? So it was a battle, not a massacre, right? There were deaths on both sides, and there wasn't mass killing in the square. This is important history. But regardless, after the Tiananmen Square event, after that, China was like, oh shit, we've been aligning with the United States because the Soviet Union stabbed us in the back. We've been helping the United States. And what happened? The United States tried to overthrow us and tried to have a color revolution against us, right? So as a result of that, Chinese foreign policy suddenly got a little bit, they backed away. During the 1990s, China and Cuba got closer, right? Cuba, the fall of the Soviet Union, right, devastated Cuba economically. But China came to the aid of Cuba. Every Cuban has a bicycle. At one point in the 90s, you know, when Cuba, they barely had any gasoline or whatever, they gave everybody a bicycle. Where did that bicycle come from? It came from China. China supplied bicycles, every Cuban household, because they were trying to save gasoline because the United States was preventing them from importing fuel. In the 1990s, they all got bicycles from China. And China's relationship, again, North Korea was just devastated after the fall of the Soviet Union. But China came to the aid of North Korea as much as they possibly could. They helped North Korea to some degree or other. And Tiananmen Square was kind of a wake-up call for China. But during the 1990s, China was still getting a huge amount of investment from the United States. And actually, in a lot of ways, you could argue that the opening up of China bailed out the U.S. economy. In the early 90s, they had the first jobless recovery. Google this, jobless recoveries. This had never happened before. But, you know, as you know, George Herbert Walker Bush Sr. was president, you know, they had the Gulf War, the U.S. Gulf War against Iraq, and the U.S. economy had a downturn, and it hurt the U.S. economy. And that's where Bill Clinton, you know, it's the economy's stupid and all of that. Bill Clinton came in and said the policies of the Republicans had hurt the working man. And Bill Clinton was like a new and improved Democrat who was much more free market and neoliberal oriented. And Bill Clinton came in. And as Bill Clinton came in, as China was opening up and taking more investment from the United States, the economy in the United States, you started to have the boom of the 90s, the good economic time, the boom of the 90s came in. And as the boom of the 90s came in, one thing that economists noticed, is this was a recovery. Wall Street was up again, profits were up again, but jobs, there were not more jobs. Unemployment was not changing. It was a jobless recovery. And it scared the shit out of economists. They said if Wall Street can rejuvenate, but jobs aren't coming to middle America, that means the gap is going to increase. And the USA in the early 90s had a jobless recovery. And then as, you know, Eastern Europe opened up, with the fall of the Soviet Union, the USA is going into Eastern Europe and plundering it, and just devastating. All of a sudden, all these Eastern European countries become captive markets. In Russia, the collective farms of Russia, they all shut down. Russia's importing their food from the United States. Russia's importing its steel. The state-run steel industries are bought by American companies, and they just shut them down. Russia has to import its steel from the United States. Eastern European countries are devastated. That rejuvenated the U.S. economy. Chinese investment. And, they always talk about debt to China. Again, that was China basically in exchange for getting U.S. investment. U.S. companies coming over there. China had to loan money to the United States, right? It was almost like China was like being forced to do that. And that bailed out the U.S. economy as well. So in the 90s, China was bailing out the U.S. economy. And the boom of the 90s was very much a result of the fact that China was bailing out the United States economically in exchange for U.S. investment and U.S. economic partnerships. And that happened, right? But you have to remember then in the late 90s, you had a number of countries across Asia, right? I mean, they call them the Asian tigers, right? Taiwan, not a country. It's part of China, but it has an independent government on Taiwan. You got Singapore. You got South Korea. You got, these governments, they call them the Asian tigers. These are authoritarian Bonapartist governments, right? And Japan was heavily invested with all of them. And, these are countries that their economies had done very well. Singapore had built itself up with like a heavily state-run economy. Park Chung-hee had built up South Korea. Taiwan had built itself up in the 1980s. In the 1990s, all these countries that are part of, they call them the Asian tigers, that, Japan is investing with them. They're also tied in with China's growth. The United States realized that all those countries were not completely trustworthy, and they were getting closer to China than they were to the United States. And that, you have the incident. Well, anyway, there's other incidents that happened. There were some incidents with Singapore and some other things where it became clear that like Bill Clinton and the United States, they didn't like Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore. They didn't like South Korea. That, Shinzo Abe was in Japan, and he was moving Japan in a much more independent direction. And so in the late 90s, you had the crash of the Asian markets, which was very much engineered. All the American firms pulled their money out of the American markets, and they crashed the Asian markets. And that was very much a financial attack on China. The late 90s, and as Bill Clinton's leaving office, they crashed the Asian markets. That was an engineered, that was a calculated move by Wall Street and George Soros to crash the Asian markets to attack China. Then it was an attack on the Asian tiger countries, mainly on Singapore, on Taiwan. Well, Taiwan's not a country, but on Taiwan's government and economy, on South Korea, and on Japan. But it was aimed at China. It's because they were feeling like China's getting too close to these Asian tiger countries. We can't trust them. And it was a calculated move. And that was an attack on China. And then, right, as Bush comes into office, and the crash of the Asian markets is hurting the U.S. economy, and all of that's happening. Then 9/11 happens. You have 9/11, and the U.S. invades Iraq. China's not supporting the U.S. invasion of Iraq. And I remember I went to an anti-war protest. I remember I was a high school student, 2005 or maybe 2006. I went to an anti-war protest in New York City. It was a huge anti-war protest, a march through New York City. The first time I'd ever been to New York City. And I walked through New York City, and it was this huge anti-war protest it was like all the Democrats, all the liberals were marching down Broadway, this huge anti-war protest that was called. All the liberals were there. And the Soros people, MoveOn.org, an organization started by George Soros, they all were handing out like water. They had these signs. They were just handing it to people. Take this sign, take this sign. And people were taking the signs. I didn't take the sign because I didn't agree with it. They were handing this crowd of people. Thousands of people were being handed signs. And what did the signs say? It said, out of Iraq into Darfur. I remember this. I was watching this. These Soros people were being paid. MoveOn.org had printed these signs, and thousands of people in New York City were being handed signs that said, out of Iraq into Darfur. don't invade Africa. Don't attack Africa. Don't attack Iraq. Don't occupy Iraq. Attack Africa. Right? That's what they were saying. And why were they saying to attack Africa? Why Darfur? Because Sudan's government was aligned with China. And Sudan has oil, and Sudan was working with China for independent investment. So the United States and Israel had fomented a civil war, and they broke South Sudan away from Sudan, and they were trying to break the Darfur region out of Sudan. They were playing Africans against each other, Muslims against Christians, right? And so Soros and all of them were saying, don't focus on the Middle East. Who cares about the Middle East? Focus on fighting China. And the big woke cause on all the campuses was Save Darfur. Do you remember Save Darfur? And it was all about how Sudan, the government of Sudan, is this evil authoritarian regime that's persecuting people, and they're Muslims attacking Christians, and it's the biggest humanitarian cause. We got to save Darfur. And South Sudan is basically a colony of Israel, right? I mean, the military there is completely run by Israel. I mean, the USA and Israel teamed up to break South Sudan away from Sudan. And then they worked to try and break Darfur away from Sudan. And they wanted to break apart Sudan because Sudan, the government of Sudan, was getting closer to China, right? And so to fight China in Africa, the United States fomented civil war in Sudan. This is a fact. This is what happened, right? And then all the stupid woke liberals, and it was funny because it was like a divide. Bush supporters and conservatives, they were going around saying, we got to fight Muslims, we got to fight Islamic terrorism, we got to support Israel. But liberals that are supposed to be smarter and more sophisticated, they were saying, no, we got to save Darfur. And then there was another woke cause, the Myanmar monks, right? It was all about how the military junta in Myanmar was oppressing Buddhist monks. And all of a sudden at my college, we were all told, we need to light candles for the Buddhist monks of Myanmar. And then there were Tibet. They tried to get Tibetan separatism going again. And it was like the CIA, oil banker liberals who eventually brought in Obama. They were the ones that were saying China is the threat. Whereas it was the conservatives that were saying, well, we need to focus on the Middle East. That was probably during the Obama administration, or the early Obama years, during the final years of Bush's presidency and the early years of Obama's presidency. That was the difference. Liberals wanted to fight China, and conservatives wanted to fight for Israel against Muslims in the Middle East and against Iran. That seemed to be the difference. And that was very, very interesting. And all of this was like forcing China, to become more and more anti-imperialist. During the 1990s, Jiang Zemin, who was the president of China, he said that China's goal was eventually to adopt the Western system. But as you can see, Hu Jintao started backing away from that, right? And you started to have differences within Chinese politics. There was a corrupt demagogue in China named Bo Xilai. I'm probably butchering that. If there's anyone who's Chinese listening to this, I do apologize. I don't speak Chinese. But in Chongqing, was it Chongqing? Yeah, in Chongqing, you had this guy named Bo Xilai. And Bo Xilai was a very corrupt politician who was using neo-Maoist communist rhetoric to get what he wanted, right? And so the Chinese government ultimately arrested him and removed him from power. But after they arrested him, then Xi Jinping ascended into leadership. They had a Communist Party Congress, and they brought in Xi Jinping, who was much more of a hardliner, much more of a Maoist communist. They brought in Xi Jinping because they realized that if they didn't, bring forth communism, which was the desire on the part of the party, you would get another corrupt bureaucrat like Bo Xilai. So you saw the rise of Xi Jinping in 2015. Xi Jinping rose as a result largely of the United States continuing to attack China. And what's interesting is when Xi Jinping took power in China, he made every Chinese Communist Party member watch two documentaries. The first documentary was about U.S. imperialism, and it was all about how the evil regime change wars that the United States has carried out Great. He said there's too much pro-American, too much belief that the United States is a good country. He required every party member to watch a documentary about the U.S. invasion of Iraq, the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, the U.S. coups. He required every member to watch it. And then he required them to watch another documentary about the fall of the Soviet Union and how the Soviet Union, the Soviet Communist Party, had been overthrown by internal confusion and by the party abandoning its communist principles, by an anti-communist faction emerging and maneuvering beneath the surface. And so Xi Jinping comes in there. He's like, I'm the new boss. And you all have to watch two documentaries, one about the evils of U.S. imperialism and another one about the fall of the Soviet Union. Boom. It was pretty clear that China was like, okay, we tried to be friends with the United States. We figured we'll keep our socialist system. But you'll let us, we'll be friendly with you. And the United States wasn't having it. And so after everything that happened, China is now moving in a very, very anti-imperialist direction, right? I mean, and China is the leader of the Belt and Road Initiative and all of that. This is important stuff that people need to know about. We got a lot more super chats. If you got something else you want me to ask about, go ahead. The social credit system. The social credit system in China is not what it's reported in Western media to be. In Western media, you hear that, oh my God, everyone is being watched all the time and rated at a certain time. And if you don't visit your grandparents enough, and if you buy too much alcohol, your score goes down and you can't get a job. That's bullshit. That's not true. What it is that certain people, China often, they've had to deal with corruption, but often like people that break Chinese law, people that engage in bribery or don't follow health and safety regulations, they have to pay fines. But the Chinese state has no way of collecting these fines, right? They don't have any way of collecting it. So what they do is they make it so you can't book a flight in China until you pay your fine. You can't get on a train in China until you pay your fine, right? It's a way of enforcing fines. That's one way. Another thing that the social credit system is that the Chinese government, the state, is the main center of the economy. They have state-run industries. They have state-run banks, and that the government has realized that a lot of these wealthy capitalists in the private sector aren't loyal to the Chinese Communist Party. And so the government has made a concerted effort to do business with people that are on board with the Communist Party and what it stands for. And so these wealthy capitalists that are emerging, that are rich from the private sector, these millionaires and billionaires, they rate them. And the ones that are in line with the party and what it wants, they get priority. The government does business with them, and it doesn't give priority to the ones that are anti-communist, right? It's the government saying, okay, we're not just going to do business with people. However, we're going to figure out who are the ones that are loyal to the party, and we're going to give them priority when we do business, and who are the ones who are not loyal to the party. That's very smart, right? That if the government is trying to stay in power, trying to move towards socialism, trying to carry out Xi Jinping's vision for a moderately prosperous socialist society, it's important to give state contracts and give business to those who are in line with the party's goals, and not reinforce and reward the folks that are against the party, right? That's the party just being smart and trying to make sure that it's doing business with people that are loyal to it. It's not what you've read about. And it makes sense, right? Corporations do that. If you're an anti-Microsoft guy, if you're on Facebook and Twitter talking shit about Microsoft, do you think your firm is going to partner with Microsoft? Of course not. Microsoft calculates who is it strategic for us to do business with, who isn't it strategic to do business with, right? Well, that's what the Chinese Communist Party is doing. It's saying, okay, there's all these millionaires and billionaires, there's all these private companies. Which ones are loyal to the party and what we're about? We're going to give them priority when we do business. And the ones that are talking smack and they're against the party, we ain't going to do business with them. It's that. So that's important as well. And there's more to it. But there you go. Next question. Was revolutionary defeatism not accepted by Leninist parties during World War II? Yeah, you could argue that World War II was an exception to Leninist revolutionary defeatism. At the beginning of the Second World War, before the Soviet Union was attacked, the communist parties were advocating, they were promoting pacifism. If you read Earl Browder's book, The Way Out, the communist parties of the world, they were against the Second World War. But then as the Soviet Union was attacked, as Pearl Harbor was attacked, as it became very clear that this was a fight to defend the Soviet Union, it was also a fight to defend the right to have labor unions, that the fascists were actively trying to, destroy the democratic countries and mobilize an all-out destruction of the Soviet Union. Yes, that was a situation where the communist parties largely repudiated and weren't practicing revolutionary defeatism. That's certainly true. Now, one thing that's important to note is that if the USA was a socialist society, imagine if the USA had a Marxist government, it still would have been necessary to align with the Soviet Union against the Nazis, right? I mean, I can't imagine if the USA had been a socialist country and Nazi Germany had invaded the Soviet Union, the USA would have sided with the Soviet Union. So, the fact that the Popular Front government of Roosevelt aligned with the Soviet Union and the communists supported that, was that technically not revolutionary defeatism? Yes. But in a lot of ways, the Second World War was not an inter-imperialist rivalry. It was fascism attempting to destroy socialism and also, trying to spread fascism to the countries of Western capitalism. So, and trying to defeat the Popular Front governments of the British Labour Party, of Roosevelt, etc. The Second World War really started out with the Spanish Civil War, where Italy and Germany, moved to destroy the Spanish Republic. The Soviet Union and Mexico sent, weapons and support to the Spanish Republic. And the U.S. imperialists were neutral, and they basically tried to do everything they could to prevent anyone else from aiding Spain. So there you go. Why did China's market reforms initially damage the standard of living and job security for Chinese workers? Next question. Okay. Would it be appropriate to resurrect Whig ideology that rejects radical liberalism and radical conservatism? I don't think so. No. The Whig Party, the reason that the Whig Party, this is what you have to remember. The Whig Party, the British Whig Party, they were the biggest advocates of free market policies that there ever were. They were more socially liberal, but they were advocates of free market policies. And the American Whig Party was very much modeled on the British Whig Party, right? And before, nowadays we talk about left and right. We talk about, the left as being synonymous with socialism, social liberalism, but also economic socialism. The right, traditionalism, conservatism, and also free market policies. But before that, before you had like the left as we speak of it in the modern era, socialism, Marxism, and social liberalism versus traditionalism and economic liberalism, free market policies. Before we had that, there was a formulation they called it was people joked that it was libertarian and populist. You had populist policies that were socially conservative, against drinking alcohol. The Republican Party, they were in favor of prohibition. They were against drinking alcohol, but also in favor of, policies that benefited the common man, right? Populism that was socially conservative, religious, traditional family, against alcohol, but also against the big monopolies and trusts, and libertarian policies, the Whig Party, which was, they were all about big corporations and such. I mean, this is the divide, right? It was libertarian and populist before it became left versus right. The rise of Marxism and social democracy kind of changed up everything. And the Republican Party, in its origins, was some kind of attempt to, break away with the Whig Party and start something that was more or less social democratic. And then eventually the Free Soilers and the radical, the populist and radical wing of the Republican Party broke away and became the Populist Party, or the People's Party. William Jennings Bryan was the leader of it. He gave his Cross of Gold speech and all of that. And then as the Populist Party became more and more racist, William Jennings Bryan brought the Populist Party into the Democratic Party. And so that's how things went down. It was not exactly like that. The Republicans started out as a very radical, revolutionary leftist party, that was aligned with the revolutions of Europe. It kind of deteriorated into a regular party of conservatism and big business. And then the populists broke away from it and were continuing the Lincoln, the Free Soilers and the labor unions that formed the Populist Party. And then the populists became racist. And as the populists became racist, they moved into the Democratic Party. Increasingly, the populists started saying things like the Republican Party gives jobs to black people that could go to white people. The Republican Party betrayed the white people of the South and sold out the American. The populists became increasingly racist and anti-Semitic. They went into the Democratic Party. William Jennings Bryan, and he lost. He didn't win, but he was a Democratic candidate who lost, but he was the candidate for president. He'd been a populist and he went into the Democratic Party. Historical nihilism and its significance. So I don't see it that way. I don't see the Whigs playing the same role in American history as you do, Pella. That's okay. That's okay. Bourgeois equality. How do communists think about equality? Well, look, this isn't the answer you're looking for, okay? But I think bourgeois law, in bourgeois sense, it's equality before the law, right? That's the focus in bourgeois legality. The government treats everyone the same. The hole in that logic is that not everyone has the same resources. Not everyone has the same access to wealth. Not everyone has the same opportunities in life, right? So that's the flaw in bourgeois equality, right? The idea is one man, one vote, we're all equal. Well, at the end of the day, everyone knows that Rockefeller is way more powerful than I am. And that even though we have one vote, that's not where things are decided, that wealth is power. And theories of bourgeois equality do not recognize that, right? It's the idea that the government treats us all the same, one man, one vote. We all get prosecuted by the same courts. We're all subject to the same laws. We have equality. Well, we don't, because there is economic inequality, and there is a huge amount of inequality in our society. But that's not the focus, because equality, the way we talk about equality, the way leftists and socialists or democratic socialists or leftists talk about equality in America is all wrong. Because equality is based on abundance. And this is what we learned over the course of the Cold War. You cannot build an egalitarian society in poverty. You can't do it. Was it, in the final years of Stalin's life, when we talk about socialism and communism, socialism is a society where the banks, factories, and industries and the major centers of economic power are operated for public good and not the profits of a few. Communism, the ultimate goal of communism, is a world without inequality, a world from each according to his own ability to each according to his needs, a world where there is no social hierarchy, where everyone is basically equal. There is no more division of labor. There's no inequality. It's a world of total equality, okay? Communism is a world of total equality. Socialism is a society where the means of production and the economy is rationally organized and you've abolished the anarchy of production. The thing that is missing is that the way socialism transitions to communism is by creating abundance. Okay? The road to abolishing inequality, the road to abolishing social hierarchies, the road to abolishing inequality, the road to abolishing the state is abundance. It's through generating huge amounts of wealth that you get rid of inequality. You cannot forcibly get rid of inequality. As long as you have a certain state of scarcity, there is out of necessity going to be social hierarchies. When there's not enough to go around, you got to have police to make sure no one steals from anybody else, right? When there's not enough to go around, some will have and some will have not. And you're going to have to reward people who work harder and incentivize them to work harder. And you cannot build a society of equality in a state of abundance. equality requires, overwhelmingly, equality requires abundance. And this is what was lost during the Cold War because the socialist countries were isolated and attacked. Writing it down. Because the socialist countries were attacked, because the socialist countries were isolated and barricaded, because they were, basically socialism didn't happen the way Marx thought it would happen. Marx thought the most advanced capitalist countries would move towards socialism first, right? That's what Marx thought. And Lenin came along and discovered imperialism and said, no, it's going to come from the colonized countries, the countries that have been kept in a state of underdevelopment by the domination of Western capitalism. They're going to have to overthrow Western capitalism and use socialism to industrialize. So socialism came from the poorest countries first, because that was the only way they could get out of their poverty. Western capitalism was keeping them poor. Richard, I am not familiar with that. I can't comment on it. The answer is I am not familiar with Wallerstein's work, so I just can't comment on it. So the countries that developed socialism first were the countries that were the poorest, right? They were the poorest. So as a result of that, they were trying to they built state-run economies. They built up their industries. They mobilized 5-year plans on the basis of poverty, and they raised themselves up. And they were immediately attacked and subject to sanctions and barricaded, and the imperialists cut them off. And as they were facing, isolation, they said, okay, well, maybe we're isolated. Maybe the NATO countries have a treaty that forbids us from getting our technology, but we are going to show the world that we are egalitarian. We are going to try to build the most fair and equitable society we can. We're going to raise up the status of women and make women equal to men. We're going to empower people. We're going to show that we're going to build the most fair, equitable society. And that was a huge mistake. And in the final years of his life, Stalin started talking about, he said, the USSR were entering the early stages of communism in the Soviet Union. Well, he was wrong. They were not. The Soviet Union was not even at the level that Western capitalism was at. They were a socialist country, but they were not entering the early stages of communism. And then in Cuba, for the first couple years after the revolution, Che Guevara, right, who was a very heroic individual, but he was somebody who was from the middle class and become a revolutionary. He tried to build an ultra-egalitarian society in Cuba. He tried to not use material incentives. He wrote a pamphlet called Man and Socialism in Cuba, and it's wrong. He argued that in Cuba, they were not going to use material incentives. People were going to go out and work just for the good of the country, and it didn't work. And in China, they had the Cultural Revolution. And in the Cultural Revolution in China, they tried stuff like that, getting rid of material incentives, right? Everyone just works because it's for the good of the nation. And, the factory would have a break in the middle of the day where they studied Hegel, and you can read about this. There's a very good book called Daily Life in Revolutionary China by an Italian member of parliament who went to China in the 70s. And they were doing all kinds of stuff to try and make China a totally equal, egalitarian society in poverty. They sent all the young people from the cities. All the urban youth of China were sent to the countryside. Why? Because 90% of the country lived in the countryside. So it was unfair that these young people got to grow up in the cities with electricity and stuff. So they sent them to the countryside to learn from the peasants and, give up their privilege of living in the city. You can't do this. You cannot build a society based on equality in poverty. Pol Pot tried this, right? He burned all the money and he got rid of money. And he forcibly deported all the people who lived in the cities into the countryside to make it more equal, because the privilege of the people in the cities, it was unfair to the people who lived in the countryside. So they forcibly deported all the people out of the cities. It didn't work. And Deng Xiaoping had the brilliance to come forward and say, you can't do this. You cannot build an egalitarian society in poverty. The basis of breaking down inequality is abundance. Social hierarchies and inequality is based on scarcity. And the way to move towards social equality is by creating abundance. That's basic Marxism. Go and read the Critique of the Goethe Program by Karl Marx. He makes that abundantly clear. right? Critique of the Goethe program. This is Karl Marx, his criticism of the German Social Democratic Party. They had their founding convention. They wrote the Goethe program. And Karl Marx read the Goethe program, and he said, this is all wrong. He read the Goethe program. He said, it's all wrong. And I believe I have it underlined, right? And he talked about how you can't have equality in a socialist society, only when you get to communism. Only under communism can you have full equality, and communism is based on abundance. Trying to find it here. But it's extremely important, and I've screenshotted it and I've quoted it at people many, many times, right? Because it's a really important point. It's a very, very, very important point. Right. Here it is. Right? These defects are inevitable in the first phase of communist society, as it is just emerged from the prolonged birth pangs of capitalist society. Right can never be higher than the economic structure of society and its cultural development conditioned thereby. Meaning you cannot create equality if the economic structure of society and its cultural development is still primitive, right? If you still have a society without vast abundance, you cannot create right that is higher. He says, in the higher phase of communist society, after the enslaving subordination of the individual to the division of labor, and with it the antithesis between mental and physical labor has vanished. After labor has become not only a means of life, but life's prime want, meaning a society with so much wealth where people only work because they feel like it, right? That's what we're talking about here. We're talking about a very high-tech society where labor is life's prime want, meaning you work because you feel like it. You don't have to, right? After the productive forces have increased with the all-around development of the individual and all the springs of cooperative wealth flow more abundantly, only then can the narrow horizon of bourgeois right be crossed in its entirety. And only then can society inscribe on its banner, from each according to his own ability to each according to his needs. Only then, right? Only then can you have total equality. When there's so much wealth that people work only because they want a wealth, the springs of wealth flow more abundantly. The point of socialism is to lift the artificial restraints on capitalism that prevent wealth from being created. As I've explained many times on these streams, under capitalism, wealth leads to poverty. In a rational society, self-driving cars would be a great innovation. It would lead to greater abundance. But instead, under capitalism, self-driving cars are going to lead to mass unemployment and riots in the streets, right? That capitalism is a system where profits are in command, and the more efficient technology becomes and the more goods that are created, the poorer people get. Socialism and the centrally planning of the economy gets over this contradiction, and it leads toward creating a society with so much wealth where human creativity and abundance is unleashed, where technology speeds ahead, and at that point you can have enough wealth that social hierarchies and inequality fades away. That's what Marx is getting at, and that's the Marxist view of equality. That's the Marxist view of equality, that right can never be higher than the economic mode of production. And that's what's really important to get. All right. And then Lumpia asks a very good question. How did Lenin improve on Marx, and how did Mao improve on Lenin? Lenin understood that capitalism had developed into its monopoly stage of imperialism. Marx thought the revolution would come from the West, but Lenin understood what was happening in the economy in the 1890s, 1880s, and he understood that capitalism was developing into imperialism. And Lenin understood and analyzed how the social democratic movement, the Second International, the Marxist parties, the Goethe program, the German Social Democratic Party, the British Labour Party, how the socialist movement of Marx was degenerating into not a revolutionary movement of the workers, but instead a mechanism for stabilizing capitalism. And Lenin understood that social democracy was becoming a tool of imperialism and stabilizing the Western capitalist countries. Lenin understood that capitalism was expanding into a global monopoly system. And Lenin understood that it would be the struggle of oppressed nations and colonized nations that had been kept poor that would be the basis for revolutionary energy in the 20th century, that the revolutionary wind would be blowing from the east and not the west. That was Lenin. That was Lenin's great breakthrough. And Lenin said you have to support nationalism. You have to support the people, the peoples of oppressed nations that are fighting for their independence. We have to oppose Western capitalism and imperialism. We have to break with social democracy and the Second International, because those parties, as much as they don't admit it, even though they sound like Marxists, their movement is basically just becoming a mechanism for stabilizing Western capitalism. Lenin said that if you live in an imperialist country, it is your all-out duty to oppose imperialist wars, right? And to turn imperialist wars in around the world into civil wars at home. That's what Lenin said. Turn imperialist war into civil war. Soldiers, turn your guns around. Your real enemy is at home. That's Marx. I mean, that's Lenin. That's all the brilliance of Lenin. Lenin took the crisis of Marxism that was breaking out across Europe, where the Marxist movement had deteriorated into this lame, reformist movement that was just about stabilizing Western capitalism, that supported World War I and sent 20 million workers off to their deaths. Lenin said, this movement is a stinking corpse. Marxism has turned into its opposite, but the historical and objective laws of history that Karl Marx understood can lay the basis for a revolutionary movement of colonized people in Africa and Asia and South America, Central America. It can be the basis for breaking them free. That's what Lenin discovered. And it's really important. Marxism without Lenin in our time is pretty outdated. If you're still waiting for the factory workers of Germany to rise up and seize their factories, you're way behind, right? Imperialism and this, and the split in socialism. Go and read Lenin's very important 10-page essay, Imperialism and the Split in Socialism. Lenin rescued Marxism from social democracy. That Marx's ideas were being watered down into a mechanism for stabilizing Western capitalism. The Western capitalist countries were developing an aristocracy of labor that was enabling them to go out and colonize the world, right? And Lenin said, nope. The fight against capitalism is the fight against imperialism. And it will be the colonized people resisting imperialism that will be the basis of revolutionary energy. That's Lenin. And Lenin realized that Russia, even though it was like part of the imperialist world at the time, that Russia was not a Western country. And he developed a method of organizing the Russian people against capitalism. It was called the Party of New Type, Bolshevism, democratic centralism, agitation and propaganda. These are all unique concepts developed by Lenin that were completely different than how the European Marxist parties argued. Lenin set up a new political party. The Bolsheviks were unlike. They were a new form of party that was uniquely Russian. It was for Russian conditions. Russia had a long history of secret societies. Read about the Old Believers. Read about the Decembrists, right? And that in Russia, among the young people, the intellectuals, and the people that wanted to fight against the Tsar, there had been a history of forming these secret societies, taking oaths to give the whole of your life to the revolution. This was all very Russian. right? And in Russia, it was about 60% illiteracy. The peasantry couldn't read and write. A lot of the factory workers couldn't read and write. So forming among the revolutionary intellectuals a party of new type, of people who give the whole of their lives and they agitate the broad masses and they propagate to the advanced. They find the advanced and they propagate to them, and they find the agitators in the factories and they propagate to them. And they agitate the advanced, but they agitate the broad masses into a greater confrontation, and they propagate to the advanced. These are all unique methods. And democratic centralism, you keep your disagreements internal within the party. You have one newspaper that speaks for the party, right? And you keep your fights internal. And when you make a decision, everyone carries it out, whether they agree or not, they carry it out, right? This is all Lenin. This is Lenin, right? This is Lenin. Now, what did Mao improve upon Lenin? Well, Mao realized that the Chinese Revolution was going to come from the peasantry. China was a deeply impoverished country, and the overwhelming majority of the population were peasants. And Mao grew up in the countryside. And like 30 years before Mao was born, there had been a huge civil war called the Taiping Uprising, in which some peasant, had met Christian missionaries and learned about Jesus and declared he was Jesus's younger brother, sent to create God's kingdom on earth. And they created the Taiping heavenly kingdom. And 30 years before Mao was born, there was this huge peasant uprising all over China with the goal of creating God's kingdom on earth. And Mao knew about it and studied it. And he said, wow. And Mao, his father was a wealthy peasant, but Mao grew up in Hunan in a peasant area. And Mao saw that the peasants were very oppressed and that there was a basis for the peasants to rise up. And then Mao, he moved to the cities. He studied at a university. And he joined, he formed a group of young Chinese nationalist anarchists. It was called the New People's Study Society, the New People's Study Group. And they went around boycotting Japanese goods. And they were Chinese nationalists, essentially. But they were inspired by Bakunin. And they were studied by Kropotkin, because Kropotkin was a Russian revolutionary who organized the peasantry. And Mao knew that it would be the peasants that would make the revolution in China. And then when the Chinese Communist Party was formed, they formed a united front with the KMT. They organized in the cities. And then the KMT nationalists betrayed the united front, and they forced they exterminated the Communist Party. In 1927, Chiang Kai-shek launched his White Terror and started killing the communists. But right before the White Terror started, Mao wrote an amazing essay that we included in the CPI manual. It's called Report on an Investigation in the Hunan Province. And in that essay, Mao is saying it's going to be the peasantry who lead the revolution. It's going to be the peasantry. It's not going to be the factory workers. It's not going to be the urban workers. It's not even going to be Chinese nationalism. It's going to be the peasantry. And traditional Marxism said, no, only the proletariat, only the industrial working class is revolutionary. And Mao said, the peasantry are going to be the revolutionaries, but we can lead the peasantry, and we can lead them with proletarian ideology. This is very important. He said that you can have a peasant revolution led by proletarian ideology. And he broke out of the dogmatism that the Marxists had, that only factory workers could make a revolution. And he said, no. Stalin said that it would be on the basis of Chinese nationalism that the revolution would happen. Trotsky said only the factory workers could be revolutionary. But Mao said, no, the peasantry will be the powder keg of the revolution. And the peasantry will be the key class in the revolution. But the factory workers will be part of it. But the national capitalists will be part of it too. And the middle income peasants will be part of it. And the Communist Party, with its proletarian scientific Marxist ideology, will sit at the center of a movement to emancipate the entire country. And that was Mao's breakthrough, that a block of four classes, of which the peasantry is the overwhelming majority, led by the Communist Party with its proletarian ideology, could carry out the revolution. Right? That was a huge breakthrough on Mao's part. In addition to that, Mao developed methods for organizing in China that were unique to China's conditions. You know, people always ask, why is Mao always talking about the 4 great thises and the 5 great that's, the 10 great relationships, the 4 olds and the 4 news, right? Why, or the 4 alls? Why is Mao talking that? That's Confucian. It's Confucianism. That's China's Confucian tradition. You memorize the 4 great alls, right? The 10 great relationships. This is very uniquely Chinese. And when you're organizing in a society where you have mass illiteracy among the peasantry, if someone can't read or write, they can memorize the 10 great relationships, right? This is all uniquely Chinese. On top of that, Mao understood that one of the big issues in China was the Confucian family structure, and that there was a great amount of rage on the part of young people in China against the Confucian family structure. That was something that many young Chinese people were very infuriated by and had a lot of anger about. And Mao tapped into the anger of young people, right? Mao was a high school principal. The first essay that Mao ever published was about the need for physical education, working together, exercising together, to include exercise in schools, right? And that Mao had a way of tapping into the anger of young Chinese adolescents at the very traditional, feudal, patriarchal family structure. Mao also had a particular interest in women. Right. And that's one thing going back to even before Mao was a communist, when Mao was organizing the New People's Study Group, young women who refused to get into marriages, who refused to accept arranged marriages, would run and join Mao. And thank you, Richard. I'm back. Mao had wrote one of his early essays was about a famous young Chinese woman who committed suicide. And he talked about the oppression of women. And Mao had a particular belief that the fury of women at their oppression and the anger of women at their degradation was going to be a key part of the revolution. And, from the beginning, they had women's divisions of the military. One of the most famous operas in China during the Cultural Revolution was called The Red Detachment of Women. There was another opera that was very famous called The White-Haired Girl. Right? It was about a girl with white hair who became a revolutionary hero. All of this, the white-haired girl, the red detachment of women, Mao had an understanding of where the energy was in China. He did what a communist is supposed to do. A communist is supposed to go into society and say, where are the contradictions? Where is the energy to change society? And how can I maneuver within that energy to push forward revolution? The revolution wasn't going to drop down from the sky. It was the anger of the peasantry that was already there. It was the anger of the youth that was already there. It was the anger of the women that was already there. That was what was going to make the revolution. And Mao broke with the dogmatism of the Western Marxists and of the Communist International that said, it'll be the oppression of China as a nation, Chinese nationalism. Well, that was a big part of it. And, the Trotskyites that said it was the factory workers, Mao said, no, he understood China way more than the Comintern did. He understood China way more than the dogmatic Marxists were. He understood where the energy was in his society. And he said, you know what? If we're going to win this thing, we got to go where the energy is. The energy is with the peasantry. The energy is with the youth. The energy is with the women. And it was on the basis of the peasantry and the youth and the women that Mao led the Chinese Revolution. And he led the youth and the women and the peasantry with a proletarian ideology and with scientific Marxism, but he wasn't dogmatic in trying to make it happen in places it wasn't happening. And Mao's brilliance is really responsible for the fact that if you go in the United States right now, where is the energy? Where's the energy in opposition to the FBI coming from? Where is the energy in opposition to the wars and imperialism coming from? Where is the energy in opposition to the big banks and corporations coming from? Where is the energy in opposition to Silicon Valley and the tech censorship coming from? Where is it coming from? Is it coming from the wokes? No. Is it coming from the socialist groups? No. The energy of resistance in the United States right now is coming from the MAGA. Now, that doesn't mean we should agree with them, but that means that if we're serious Marxists, that's who we have to learn to engage with. And that's a tough pill to swallow, but that's what Mao was trying to tell the Chinese communists in his essay. He said, it's going to be the peasantry. It's going to be the peasantry. Go read the report on the Hunan province. He's saying, look, the anger, the resistance is coming from the peasantry. That's who it's coming from. And even though we're rich city kids, and even though the peasants scare us, and even though when they revolt, they do crazy things like cut people's heads off, and that's who we got to relate to. If we're going to have a revolution, we got to relate to the peasantry. And Mao could see that's where the energy was. And if you're in America in 2022, you got to realize that the energy is coming from the MAGA. Those people stormed the Capitol, for Christ's sakes. Look at what Carrie Lake is doing. Listen to Tulsi Gabbard. They're wrong. They love capitalism. They hate China. They think free markets are the answer to everything. They're wrong. They're wrong in a lot of ways. They scapegoat immigrants. They're wrong. But that's where the energy is. The left is completely co-opted. The energy is coming from the MAGA. And so if you're serious, you got to figure out how we can win communism, win MAGA people to communism. Doesn't mean you have to pander to them. Doesn't mean you have to agree with reactionary things that they say, but that's who we should be trying to appeal to, not the wokes, right? This is Mao's brilliance, right? You go where the energy is, right? And that's a tough pill for people to swallow. And that's Mao's great breakthrough, right? That's what I'll say about Mao. But in a lot of ways, I'm not a Maoist, right? I'm not an MLM. I'm not a Marxist, Leninist, Maoist. I'm not that, because Maoism is for China. Where's the peasantry in America? There ain't no peasantry here, right? We don't have filial piety. We don't have the traditional patriarchal family structure like they had in China. We don't have foot binding here. We don't have arranged marriages here, right? So, Mao Zedong thought is very much socialism with Chinese characteristics. I know it's a different concept that Deng Xiaoping developed, but it's for China. The method that Mao used, identifying where the energy is, that's something we can learn from. But the actual thing, like, are we going to, organize the peasantry of America? No, there's no peasantry here. So, that's what we can take from Mao. All right. How has China stood against postmodernism, disorientation, and liberalism? Well, right now they're having a revival of communist culture in China, right? People are writing out the Chinese Communist Party's constitution. They're bringing back red culture. They're pushing Marxism on the universities. They're revamping the educational system. They had a lot of schools in China that were just teaching Western crap. They're getting rid of that. China is very much realizing they need to fight the wave of Western liberalism. And part of that is social media. They don't like Western social media in China. They don't trust Facebook and Twitter and all of that. And do you blame them? I don't blame them, right? And they're very much, they're trying to limit the amount of time that young people spend playing video games, limit the amount of time young people spend on the computers. Again, do you blame them? No, I think it makes perfect sense, right? And they're trying to make sure that it's Silicon Valley doesn't get access to the minds of their population, right? And I respect that. And they're trying to revive the communism, the communist culture, and a lot of the things that got watered down in the 90s are being brought back, and I think that's great. All right, how did sports become propaganda for imperialism? Well, look, first of all, athletic type people are the kind of people they want in the military. Right? I mean, people that are very physically fit, and very disciplined enough to become an athlete. That's like the ideal for the military. So part of that is just military recruitment, but part of it is also that, that sporting events, it's a group of people that are gathering, right? It is athletic in performance. And, it used to be a lot more things started with the national anthem. It used to be that I think even still today, on military bases, when they show movies, they begin with the national anthem. It used to be, the Pledge of Allegiance or the national anthem was at everything. Well, they do it at sporting events now. That makes sense. That's how you did things, right? In the area I grew up in, there was a private Christian school that was run by Mennonites. And they wouldn't play the national anthem at their events because they're Mennonites, right? They don't salute any flag or whatever. And people got really mad at them, like, oh my God, they're so unpatriotic and stuff. But that's their religion. They're Mennonites. They don't believe in anything military. But part of that is just recruitment, but it's backfired. Look at Muhammad Ali, right? This guy was an athlete, famous athlete, boxer, and they sent him a draft notice to go to Vietnam, and he refused to go. And he became kind of a celebrity for refusing to fight in Vietnam because of his beliefs. He was a member of the Nation of Islam, a black nationalist, so there you go. Sometimes it backfires on them. So yeah, but part of it is just military recruitment. I mean, they have recruitment budgets. It's part of their budget in the Air Force and the military and all that. They're recruiting. And they want the kind of people that are into sports to join the Army, because if you're very athletic, very physically fit, you're the kind of person who, would be, very useful in the military. So part of it is just recruiting, I think. It's just that simple, especially now that we don't have a draft in the United States. We have an all-volunteer army. They need to actively recruit. All right. I don't think Grant was the second greatest president. I think the second greatest president was Roosevelt, but Grant played a progressive role. Ulysses S. Grant, that's the next super chat question. Ulysses S. Grant, he sent the U.S. military to fight the Ku Klux Klan. In Tennessee, after the Civil War, you had a pro-Confederate insurgency to prevent black people from voting, to, target the Union League and radical Republicans. You had this Ku Klux Klan that emerged in Tennessee, led by Nathan Bedford Forrest. And Ulysses S. Grant sent the U.S. military to fight the Ku Klux Klan. That was progressive. Ulysses S. Grant, he also protected Native Americans. And when the settlers were calling for the military to go after Native Americans, there were times where he sent the military to protect Native Americans, which was quite rare in those days. Now, Grant was quite corrupt, from what I understand. But if you read his memoir, the memoirs of Ulysses S. Grant, you can see that he very much identified with the radical republicanism, right? Who killed JFK? He identified with the radical republicanism of the era, right? He identified with the fight to destroy slavery. He fought in the Mexican-American War. But if you read Ulysses S. Grant's autobiography, he says that was an unjust war for the slaveholders. I mean, there's this whole thing in the United States that if, you can't criticize the Iraq War because of the soldiers. You can't criticize the Vietnam War because of the soldiers. Well, Ulysses S. Grant, who was a president, who was the hero of the U.S. Civil War, he fought in the Mexican-American War. And in his autobiography, he says the Mexican-American War was bullshit. And he says it was an unjust war to get a new slave state, to steal Texas from Mexico so the slave owners could have more plantations. So if Ulysses S. Grant can talk smack against the Mexican-American War, anyone can talk smack against any war. But I digress. All right, next question. Why did the Chinese market reforms initially damage job security and living standards for Chinese workers? Well, any transition economically is going to have that effect, but I'm not sure it had that effect as much as you might think. I think it hurt initially. It hurt the workers in state-run industries, and it did get rid of some of the job security and stuff. But at the same time, living standards were rapidly rising in the 80s. In China, living standards were going up overall. In the short term, very short term, the first couple of years, it had some destabilizing effects. But overall, in the 80s and 90s, there were big leaps in the Chinese living standard going on. Any transition, any economic shift that is dramatic is going to have a negative effect at the very beginning. But the question is, does it fix itself quickly, and does it start improving? Living standards in Russia went down in the immediate aftermath of the revolution. First 3, 4, or 5 years after the Russian Revolution were not good. But then when Stalin started his 5-year plans, things started getting better. So there you go. All right. I don't know what you mean by historical nihilism. I mean, are you referring to the people who say nothing, there is no historical progress? Is that what you mean? That's a common trend among postmodernists. We're not getting better. It's just, there is no future and no past, and the past, the present, and the future are equal. Everything is the same. I disagree with that. I believe in historical progress. But, it's part of postmodernism, right? There is no hope. We're not getting better. We're not getting worse. Everything's just this pointless, it's part of postmodernism. I assume that's what you're referring to. Maybe you're referring to a different trend. That's what I would assume you're referring to. All right. What electoral reforms are worth fighting for? No, the 4-point plan. First step, mass program of infrastructure to rebuild the country. Second step, public control of natural resources. Third step, public control of banking. Fourth step, an economic bill of rights. I think going to politicians and saying, do you advocate this? Are you for this? Are you against it? Is a great thing to do. Because those 4 steps would lead to an all-out confrontation with the bourgeoisie. In order to implement those 4 steps, which, again, you could have those 4 things and not have socialism, but they would create such a confrontation with the bourgeoisie that there would be an all-out class struggle in the United States if those 4 things were being actively demanded. If politicians were getting elected to office on a platform of those 4 things, there would be all-out class struggle against the U.S. imperialist monopolies. The big oil companies, the big banks would fight it like crazy. The population would be for it. They would want the jobs. They'd want the education. They'd want the health care. If you mobilized around those 4 demands, if you had a mass movement of those 4 demands, you could effectively be mobilizing some kind of revolution in the United States very easily. All right. The last super chat I've got here, unless anyone has anything further, is who probably killed JFK? We all know that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. They have a tradition in Dallas, Texas called Take Your Rifle to Work Day, even though the parade route printed in the newspaper was different. And Lee Harvey Oswald had no idea that the parade was coming by his office. He just happened to be at work at the book depository, and he just happened to bring his rifle to work that day. And he looked out the window and saw that JFK was going by in his motorcade. And he thought, what the heck? I've got my rifle right here. And they changed the parade route, and it just so happens to go by my window. So what the heck? I'll just take a quick shot. And that's how it worked. And, he was not a very good marksman, but, he just got lucky, and the rest is history, right? We all know what happened, right? Come on, man. Don't spread conspiracy theories on this stream, right? We don't like conspiracy theories here. It was Take Your Rifle to Work Day. Very common Texas tradition. Anyone from Dallas can tell you about that. Once a year, everyone brings a big gun with a scope on it to work. That's just like a thing they do down there in Texas. I mean, everyone knows about that. Everybody knows about it. And, and they changed the parade route, and he just happened to see at the window, and, it wasn't a very good shot, but there you go. I mean, why do you ask me these things? Everybody knows this. Everybody knows that. Everybody knows that. And then, and just so happens that after killing the president, they were taking him from one jail to another, and some guy, some famous gangster who just happened to have a brain tumor, was mad about it, and he was just so upset by seeing Kennedy's widow on TV. He thought, what the heck? I'm somehow going to know when they're taking him to a jail from another jail, and I'm going to walk up to him on live television and shoot him, right? And that just happened. And he just happened to have a brain tumor, so he couldn't explain why he did it, and he died shortly afterwards. Come on, man. Like, what's weird about any of this? What's weird about any of this, right? Right? I mean, this all makes complete sense. There's no foul play here. No foul play whatsoever, right? Take your rifle to work day. Guy takes a lucky shot that's almost impossible, kills the president. They arrest him. They take him to jail. They're taking him to another jail, and another guy who just happens to be mad about it walks up to him and somehow blows him away, right? I mean, that happens all the time. When police are taking a prisoner from one place to another, and all the cops have guns, it's really common for someone to walk up to the cops with a prisoner, all those cops that have guns pull out their own gun, kill the prisoner, and not themselves get shot and then just die of a brain tumor later, right? I mean, that happens all the time, right? Don't people just walk up to cops and pull guns out and kill prisoners that they're escorting? I mean, cops, when they see that someone has a gun, when they see that someone pulls out a gun and is aiming to shoot it, they don't like shoot back or anything, right? That never happens, right? I mean, it's like, come on, my friends. Come on, my friends. Right? But I think I've made my point. But it's important, you don't want to say exactly what happened, because we don't. We don't know exactly what happened. But I think my point is made. And that's a way they can trap you, right? If you start talking like you know what happened, when you don't really know what happened. I do not know what really happened about JFK, but I do know the story that I just told you doesn't sound right. Be careful. Don't let them trick you into saying what actually happened, because once you start saying what actually happened, then they can go, you don't know that, and you don't know that, right? I don't know what actually happened. I can speculate about it, but I don't know what actually happened. Be careful. Be careful, because once people start talking about what actually happened, that's when they've got you. Don't let them get you. All right, folks. It's been a great stream. We hit 3 hours and 10 minutes, but it was worth it. I love you guys, this community. I'm so glad to be back. And yeah, we're going to keep doing it. We're going to keep doing it, folks. We're going to keep doing it. Yeah, I'll probably stream tomorrow at some point. We're just going to keep going every day here. Be sure to subscribe to the Caleb Maupin videos channel. I'll pull it up here for you. I'll drop the link in the chat here before I go. Why not, right? Because I can't, it'll screw up the notifications. Already, people hit the like button, hit that notifications bell, please. Because, the notifications are completely screwed up. They're just completely screwed up. I'm streaming a lot and I don't want to screw up the notifications. So I post like clips from these streams on the Caleb Maupin videos channel. Right. So go and subscribe to this channel. That's where I'm posting like clips and stuff like that. Because if I start posting those too much on this channel, no one will get a notification. I'm going to do it as much as I can because we got a bigger channel here. But please, go subscribe to that channel. If folks, I'm trying to rebuild the Patreon. We're going to have a patrons only stream in the next 10 days. So if folks want to come on the Patreon, like I said, in the next 10 days, we're going to do a patrons only stream. A lot of people, have stuck it out. People that are part of the Patreon community, they get books, they get patrons only streams, they get their own access. But there you go, folks. Make sure to hit the notifications bell. People aren't getting notifications. Make sure you're subscribed. This fucking algorithms are unsubscribing people. We don't want that. So hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, subscribe to the videos channel. I need support on Patreon. We're moving ahead, folks. You can join the Center for Political Innovation. The organization is still in effect. We're still moving ahead. And I guess on that note, we'll wrap things up. A new upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. While the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. While the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. Good night.